There's a number that should keep you awake at night, or maybe, since you're here, help you drift off thinking about just how small we really are in the grand scheme of things. 2 million years. That's how long one of our ancestor species survived on this planet. Not just survived, thrived, spread across 3 continents, endured ice ages, volcanic winters, climate catastrophes that would make our current environmental crisis look like a minor inconvenience. 2 million years of continuous existence. Now here's the uncomfortable part. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, people who look and think exactly like you, we've been around for roughly 300,000 years. Maybe a bit more if you're generous with the fossil evidence from Morocco. 300,000 years sounds impressive until you do the math. That means Homo erectus, our ancient relatives, outlasted us by a factor of nearly 7. They had staying power we haven't even begun to prove we possess. Think about what 2 million years actually means. Imagine standing at the beginning of Homo erectus's timeline and trying to see the end. You can't. It's beyond human comprehension. The entire span of recorded human history, everything from the first cities in Mesopotamia to the smartphone in your pocket, that's roughly 10,000 years. Homo erectus existed for 200 times that long. The pyramids of Egypt, those ancient monuments that feel impossibly old, they were built about 4,500 years ago. Homo erectus would have looked at the pyramids the way we look at something built last week. But here's what really matters. They didn't just exist for 2 million years by hiding in some protective ecological niche, some safe corner of the world where nothing ever changed. They survived through some of the most dramatic climate shifts in Earth's recent history. Multiple ice ages that locked up so much water in glaciers that sea levels dropped hundreds of feet. Volcanic eruptions that blacked out the sun for years. Temperature swings that would have killed any species that couldn't adapt quickly. And they kept going. Generation after generation after generation, for longer than most mammal species even exist. Meanwhile, we modern humans have been here for 300,000 years, and for most of that time we were barely hanging on. The genetic evidence tells a story of repeated population crashes, times when there might have been only a few thousand breeding pairs of Homo sapiens left on the entire planet. We've nearly gone extinct multiple times, and now, with all our technology, all our supposed mastery over nature, we're facing threats we created ourselves. Climate change, ecological collapse, the possibility of nuclear war. We're 300,000 years in, and we're not even sure we'll make it to 400,000. This isn't a story about how primitive people were tougher than us. It's not some romantic notion about noble savages living in harmony with nature. Homo erectus wasn't more virtuous or more connected to the earth. They were human. They hunted, they competed for resources, they probably fought with each other just like we do. But they had something we might be losing. They had resilience. Not the kind that comes from technology or complex social organization. The kind that comes from being adaptable enough to survive when everything changes, and everything did change. During their 2 million year run, the planet Earth was a fundamentally different place multiple times over. The climate cycled through extremes we've never experienced. The continents themselves moved, though not dramatically over such a relatively short time span. But the ecosystems, the animals they hunted, the plants they gathered, the very air they breathed, all of it transformed again and again. Species appeared and went extinct. Entire ecological communities rose and fell. And through it all, Homo erectus adapted. They didn't need to invent agriculture or writing or the internet. They just needed to be flexible enough to keep surviving whatever the planet threw at them. We look at them now through the lens of paleontology and anthropology, and we see primitive humans. Smaller brains than ours, simpler tools, no art that we can definitely identify, no clear evidence of symbolic thinking or complex language. We assume that makes us superior. But superior at what? We're superior at building civilizations, sure. Superior at abstract reasoning and technological innovation. Superior at reshaping the environment to suit our needs. But are we superior at the only thing that really matters in evolutionary terms? Survival over deep time? The fossil record suggests that Homo erectus barely changed for over 1 million years. From about 1.8 million years ago to 800,000 years ago, they remained remarkably stable anatomically and technologically. The same basic body plan, the same basic stone tools. To us that looks like stagnation. We're so used to rapid change, to progress measured in decades or even years, that 1,000,000 years of stability seems impossible to comprehend. But maybe that stability was their strength. Maybe by not over-specializing, by not becoming too dependent on any particular technology or lifestyle, they maintained the flexibility to survive whatever came next. Compare that to us. We've been recognizably modern humans for 300,000 years, but our current way of life, industrial civilization, is less than 300 years old. A blink. A fraction of a percent of our species' existence, and already we're seeing the cracks. Climate change driven by our own activities, the 6th mass extinction caused by human habitat destruction, nuclear weapons that could end civilization in an afternoon. We built something incredibly complex and powerful, but we don't know yet if it's survivable over the long term. There's a concept in ecology called the Red Queen hypothesis, from Alice in Wonderland, where the Red Queen tells Alice you have to run as fast as you can just to stay in the same place. It describes how species have to constantly evolve just to maintain their relative fitness as their environment, and competitors change. Homo erectus ran that race for 2 million years and stayed in the game. We've been running for 300,000 years, and we've run so fast, changed so quickly, that we might have run ourselves right off a cliff. This is what keeps evolutionary biologists and anthropologists awake at night. The realization that intelligence, our defining characteristic, might not be the ultimate survival trait we think it is. Intelligence let us dominate the planet in the short term. It let us bend nature to our will, at least temporarily. But has it given us the staying power of Homo erectus? Or has it made us brittle, dependent on systems that could collapse, unable to survive if we lost the technological scaffolding we've built around ourselves? Homo erectus lived through the Pleistocene epoch, a time of dramatic glacial cycles. Ice ages came and went. They watched glaciers advance from the north, covering landscapes they knew in miles of thick ice. They watched those same glaciers retreat, revealing transformed terrain, and they adapted. They moved when they needed to move. They changed their hunting strategies when their prey changed. They found new food sources when old ones disappeared. They survived. We modern humans emerged during the late Pleistocene, but we've spent most of our existence during the Holocene, the current geological epoch that began about 11,700 years ago. The Holocene has been remarkably stable climatically. Warm, but not too warm. Cool, but not too cool. Predictable seasons, reliable monsoons, stable sea levels. It's the perfect climate for agriculture and civilization. It's the climate that allowed us to build everything we have. But it's an anomaly, a brief pause between ice ages, and we don't know how we'll handle it when conditions return to the dramatic swings that were normal for most of human evolutionary history. Homo erectus never had to worry about any of this. They didn't build anything that required climate stability. They didn't depend on agriculture that could fail if rainfall patterns shifted. They didn't create supply chains that could collapse if sea levels changed. They lived in small groups, probably a few dozen individuals, moving across the landscape as needed. When conditions got bad in one area, they moved to another. When their population grew too large for local resources, some groups split off and migrated. Simple, flexible, resilient. If you're listening to this to fall asleep, you're in the right place. And if you're finding yourself thinking about deep time and our place in it, maybe hit that subscribe button. Let me know in the comments where you are and what time it is. Are you in New York at midnight? Tokyo at dawn? Sydney in the afternoon? Wherever you are, we're all descendants of survivors. The question is whether we'll survive as long as they did. So tonight, we're going to explore the story of Homo erectus, the most successful human species that ever lived, measured by the only metric that really matters in evolution: time survived. We're going to look at what they did right, how they lived, how they adapted, how they spread across the old world and endured for longer than any other human species before or since. And we're going to ask uncomfortable questions about ourselves, about whether our 300,000 years represents the beginning of a long run like theirs, or whether we're a bright flash in the pan, intelligent enough to reshape the world but not wise enough to survive the consequences. This isn't ancient history. This is the story of endurance, of what it takes to survive on a geological timescale, of the difference between being smart and being survivable, and of what we might learn from the species that came before us and lasted 2 million years. Let's begin with who they actually were, these ancient relatives who looked almost but not quite like us. who walked upright across a world we can barely imagine, who kept going when everything around them changed, the original survivors, the baseline against which all human success should be measured. Homo erectus, the species that wouldn't die. Picture this. You're standing on the African savanna about 1.9 million years ago. The sun is brutal, the kind of heat that shimmers off the ground in waves. In the distance, you see a group of figures moving across the grassland. At first glance, you might think they're human. They're walking upright, fully bipedal, with a stride that looks remarkably similar to ours. But as they get closer, you start to notice the differences. They're shorter than most modern humans, though not dramatically so. The males average about 5 feet 9 inches tall, the females closer to 5 feet 3. But their build is different. Thicker bones, denser and heavier than ours, broader shoulders, longer arms relative to their body size, though nothing like the proportions of earlier apes. Their faces would stop you cold. Heavy brow ridges that jut out over their eyes, creating deep shadows. A long, low skull that slopes back instead of rising in the high, domed shape we're used to. Prominent jaws that project forward slightly with no chin. Teeth that are larger than ours, built for a tougher diet. But here's what would really strike you. The eyes. Intelligent, aware, watching everything. These aren't animals, these are people. Different from us, yes, but recognizably human, in a way that earlier hominins weren't. They're making decisions, communicating with each other, working together to survive in a landscape full of predators that could kill them easily, and they're succeeding. This is Homo erectus, the first human species to look broadly similar to us, the first to have body proportions that would let them run long distances efficiently, the first to have a brain large enough to suggest genuine intelligence, though still smaller than ours. Early specimens had brains averaging about 900 cubic centimeters compared to our 1400. But later Homo erectus, the ones who lived closer to our own time, had brains approaching 1100 cubic centimeters, still smaller than ours, but absolutely large enough for complex thought, problem-solving and sophisticated social behavior. Their hands were capable. Recent analysis of their finger bones shows they had the precision grip necessary for making complex tools. The thumb could rotate and press against the fingers with considerable force, allowing them to manipulate small objects with skill. They weren't just bashing rocks together. They were craftspeople, creating tools that required planning and foresight, hand axes that took dozens of careful strikes to shape, cleavers with sharp cutting edges, tools that remained essentially unchanged for over 1 million years, suggesting they'd hit on designs that worked and saw no need to improve them. The skeletal evidence tells us they were built for endurance. Long legs with Achilles tendons that stored and released energy efficiently with each stride, a spring in their step that let them cover ground without exhausting themselves, narrow hips that allowed for efficient walking and running, a body plan optimized for life on the ground, in the open, far from the trees that their ancestors had relied on for safety. This was a species committed to terrestrial life in a way no previous hominin had been, and they were tough. The fossil record shows injuries that healed, broken bones that knitted back together, suggesting individuals survived severe trauma and were cared for by their group long enough to recover. One specimen from Dmanisi in Georgia, dating to about 1.8 million years ago, is an elderly individual who had lost all but one tooth long before death. The jaw had resorbed, indicating this person had been toothless for years, yet they survived. Someone was sharing soft food with them, keeping them alive when they could no longer chew. That's not just survival, that's compassion, that's society. They lived in a world we can barely imagine. Africa during the Pleistocene was simultaneously familiar and alien. Familiar in landscape, grasslands and woodlands not entirely different from what exists today in some regions, but alien in inhabitants. Saber-toothed cats prowling the same territories, giant hyenas larger than modern lions, elephants with bizarre downward-curving tusks, hippos and crocodiles far larger than their modern relatives, bovids with horns spanning 6 feet. This was megafauna country, and Homo erectus was just another medium-sized mammal trying to survive. But they had advantages. Fire, possibly, though the evidence is debated. We'll get to that. Tools, definitely. The ability to communicate, though we don't know if they had language as we understand it, and most importantly they had each other. Social cooperation that let them defend against predators, hunt large game, care for the injured and elderly. They were weaker than the big cats, slower than the antelopes, more vulnerable than almost any other animal their size, but they survived through intelligence and cooperation. The earliest clear Homo erectus fossils come from East Africa, from sites around Lake Turkana in Kenya. The most famous is Turkana Boy, a nearly complete skeleton of a juvenile male who died about 1.6 million years ago. He was perhaps 8 to 11 years old when he died, already standing about 5 feet 3 inches tall. Had he lived to adulthood, he might have reached 6 feet. His skeleton shows the fully modern body proportions that characterize Homo erectus. Long legs, short arms, a narrow pelvis, a body built for walking and running across open country. Turkana Boy tells us something else important: his growth rate. Analysis of his teeth and bones suggests he was growing more rapidly than modern human children, more like the growth pattern of chimpanzees. Modern human children have an extended childhood, growing slowly depending on adults for many years. This extended development allows time for learning complex skills and social behaviors, but it requires a stable environment where adults can protect and feed children for over a decade. Homo erectus apparently hadn't evolved this extended childhood yet. Their children grew faster, became independent sooner, needed less parental investment. This might have been an adaptation to a harsher, less predictable environment, where you couldn't guarantee a long, safe childhood. But despite this faster growth, their brains were still large enough to suggest sophisticated behavior. Studies of the inside of their skulls, using CT scans and other imaging, show brain structures that hint at advanced capabilities. Broca's area, involved in speech production in modern humans, appears enlarged in Homo erectus skulls. Does this mean they could speak? Maybe. Or maybe they had complex vocalizations that weren't quite language but served similar communicative functions. We don't know. But the hardware was there for something more advanced than simple animal calls. Their diet was flexible, and that flexibility might be one reason they survived so long. Toothwear patterns and isotope analysis of their bones suggest they ate a varied diet. Meat from hunting and scavenging, definitely. Plant foods, tubers, seeds, fruits. They weren't specialists tied to one type of food source. When game was scarce, they could survive on plants. When plants were seasonal or unavailable, they could hunt or scavenge. This dietary flexibility meant they could survive in a wide range of environments, from the forests of Java to the grasslands of East Africa to the cooler regions of northern China, and they spread. This is perhaps their most remarkable achievement. Homo erectus wasn't confined to Africa. By about 1.8 million years ago, they'd reached Dmanisi in the country of Georgia, at the gateway to Europe and Asia. By 1.6 million years ago, they'd reached the island of Java in Southeast Asia, over 7,000 miles from their African homeland. By at least 700,000 years ago, they were in China, at sites like Zhoukoudian, where Peking man was discovered. This geographic spread is staggering. No previous hominin had left Africa. Homo erectus colonized a significant portion of the Old World. How did they do it? Not in a single migration, certainly. This was probably a gradual process, groups moving into new territories following game, exploring new areas, establishing themselves, then some individuals moving further. Over hundreds of thousands of years, this slow dispersal carried them across continents. They probably stayed close to coastlines and river valleys, where water and resources were reliable. They avoided the coldest regions, at least initially, staying in tropical and subtropical zones where their relatively hairless bodies wouldn't be a disadvantage. Because here's another thing about Homo erectus. They were probably largely hairless, or at least much less hairy than earlier hominins. The evidence is indirect based on their body proportions and lifestyle, but it makes sense. Long-distance walking and running in hot climates requires efficient cooling. Fur traps heat. Hairless skin covered in sweat glands lets you cool through evaporation. Modern humans are the sweatiest primates, and Homo erectus probably wasn't far behind. This would have been crucial for their hunting strategy, which likely involved persistence hunting, tracking animals for hours until they collapsed from heat exhaustion, while the humans, cooling efficiently through sweat, kept coming. They shared the world with other human species for most of their existence. In Africa, they coexisted with late-surviving Australopithecines and with Paranthropus species, robust hominins with massive jaws built for grinding tough plant materials. In Asia, by the end of their run, they might have encountered early Homo sapiens spreading out of Africa. On islands, some Homo erectus populations evolved into strange dwarf forms, like Homo floresiensis on Flores Island. 3-foot-tall humans with brains the size of chimpanzees, who somehow maintained enough intelligence to make sophisticated tools. The human family tree wasn't a ladder, it was a bush, with multiple species existing simultaneously, sometimes in the same regions. But Homo erectus outlasted most of them. The robust Australopithecines went extinct. Paranthropus died out. Other early Homo species vanished from the record, but erectus kept going, adapting to new conditions, surviving climate shifts that eliminated other species. The last known Homo erectus fossils come from Java and date to somewhere between 117,000 and 108,000 years ago. That's almost 2 million years from the first appearance of the species, an extraordinary run by any measure. What's remarkable is how little they changed over that time. The earliest Homo erectus from Africa and the latest from Java are anatomically similar. The same basic body plan, the same skull shape, the same general features. Some regional variation certainly. Asian Homo erectus tended to have thicker skull bones than African specimens, but the overall pattern held steady for well over 1 million years. This stability suggests a species that had found a successful adaptive strategy and stuck with it. And that strategy was flexibility. Not technological flexibility necessarily. Their tools remained relatively simple and unchanged for enormous spans of time. But behavioral and ecological flexibility. The ability to live in forests or grasslands or near water. The ability to eat whatever was available. The ability to adjust their behavior to local conditions without needing to evolve new physical adaptations. They were generalists in the best sense, capable of surviving almost anywhere within their broad environmental range. They were, by the standards of human evolution, a wild success. 2 million years of continuous existence across 3 continents through multiple ice ages and climate catastrophes. They were present for the entire dramatic climate cycling of the Pleistocene. They saw landscapes transform repeatedly. They watched species appear and disappear. And through it all they persisted, generation after generation, doing what worked, raising children who would do the same, keeping the chain unbroken for longer than almost any mammal species manages. So when we look at Homo erectus, we shouldn't see primitive ancestors who are waiting to evolve into something better. We should see the most successful human species that ever lived, the benchmark, the ones who proved that our lineage could survive over deep time. They lasted 2 million years with brains smaller than ours, tools simpler than ours, technology that barely changed for 1 million years. They did it through adaptability, cooperation and resilience, and the question hanging over us modern humans, with our big brains and complex technology and 300,000 years of existence, is whether we've learned the right lessons from them, or whether, in becoming more sophisticated, we've become more fragile. There's a cave in South Africa called Wonderwerk. The name means miracle in Afrikaans, and it's fitting. Because inside this cave, buried in layers of sediment dating back 1 million years, archaeologists found something extraordinary. Ash. Not just scattered ash from a natural wildfire that happened to sweep through. Deliberate, concentrated deposits of burned material deep inside the cave, far enough from the entrance that lightning strikes or brush fires couldn't have caused it. Someone carried fire into that cave. Someone maintained it there. Someone 1 million years ago controlled fire. This might be the oldest clear evidence of fire control in human history. And if the dating holds up, it means Homo erectus was using fire much earlier than anyone previously thought possible. Fire, the technology that changes everything, the tool that separates humans from almost every other animal on Earth. A handful of other species can use tools, several can solve complex problems, but only humans control fire, and Homo erectus might have been doing it for 1 million years. Try to imagine what that means. For nearly half of their entire existence as a species, they might have had fire, not just opportunistically scavenging flames from lightning strikes or volcanic eruptions, though they certainly did that, but actually controlling it, keeping it alive, transporting it, making it work for them. If the Wonderwerk evidence is correct, fire wasn't some late addition to Homo erectus culture. It was fundamental to who they were and how they lived. But here's the frustrating thing about fire. It doesn't preserve well. Wooden structures burn completely. Organic materials turn to ash. Ancient hearths get disturbed by later inhabitants, by animal burrowing, by geological processes. What looks like an ancient campfire might be naturally burned wood from a forest fire. What looks like deliberate placement of stones around a hearth might be coincidence or later disturbance. Dating ash is tricky because it can be contaminated by more recent carbon. Every claimed early fire site gets challenged, debated, reanalyzed. The scientific arguments get heated, which is ironically appropriate. But the evidence keeps accumulating. At Gesher Beno Yaakov in Israel, a site dating to about 790,000 years ago, archaeologists found burned seeds, burned wood, and burned flint tools in organized patches that look very much like hearths. Not scattered randomly across the site, but concentrated in specific areas, suggesting deliberate, controlled burning. The burned materials include multiple species of wood, suggesting people were selecting particular types for burning, showing knowledge about which woods burn best. At Zhoukudian Cave in China, where Peking Man was discovered, there are layers containing enormous quantities of ash, burned bones, and burned stones, dating from about 700,000 years ago to as recently as 200,000 years ago. For decades, this was considered definitive proof that Homo erectus used fire. Then skeptics pointed out that the cave has unusual conditions that could concentrate naturally burned materials. The debate continues, but even the skeptics generally agree that by 400,000 years ago, fire use was widespread and definitely intentional. And once you have fire, once you control it, everything changes. Let's start with the most obvious benefit: warmth. Fire lets you survive in places you couldn't otherwise live. Homo erectus was probably largely hairless, or at least much less hairy than earlier hominins. That's fine in tropical Africa where they originated. It's a serious problem in temperate zones where winter temperatures drop below freezing. Without fire, northern China is uninhabitable for a relatively hairless primate. With fire, it becomes possible. The hearth becomes the center of life, the source of heat that keeps you alive through cold nights. Light. This one's easy to overlook because we're so used to having light available whenever we want it. But natural human vision is adapted for daylight. We're diurnal primates. Our night vision is poor compared to true nocturnal predators. Without fire, human activity stops at sunset. You huddle somewhere safe and wait for dawn. With fire, you extend the day. You can work, eat, socialize after dark. You can see predators approaching. You can plan, tell stories, teach the next generation. Fire gave Homo erectus hours of additional productive time every day. Protection. Every large predator is afraid of fire. Lions won't approach it. Hyenas stay back. Even elephants, powerful enough to destroy almost anything, avoid flames. A group of Homo erectus with a fire burning has a defense that works against any predator that roamed the Pleistocene. They're not hiding in trees or caves. They're sitting in the open, confident, because nothing will come near the flames. This is psychological freedom, the ability to sleep without fear, to rest and actually recover instead of maintaining constant vigilance. And then there's food, cooking. This is where fire becomes truly transformative. Raw meat is tough, difficult to chew, potentially contaminated with parasites and bacteria. Cooked meat is tender, easier to digest, safer to eat. The heat breaks down proteins and connective tissues, making nutrients more accessible. Your body expends less energy digesting cooked food than raw food, meaning you get more nutritional value from the same amount of meat. Some researchers think cooking was so important that it actually drove brain evolution. Larger brains require enormous amounts of energy. Cooking might have provided the caloric surplus necessary to support bigger brains, but it's not just meat. Cooking transforms plant foods too. Many tubers, roots and seeds are tough, fibrous, or even toxic when raw. Cooking breaks down these compounds, makes them digestible, neutralizes toxins. The range of available plant foods expands dramatically once you can cook. This dietary flexibility would have been crucial during times of scarcity. When game is unavailable, you can survive on cooked tubers and seeds that would be inedible raw. There's evidence that Homo erectus understood this. At several sites, archaeologists have found burned and cracked bones that show signs of deliberate heating, possibly to extract marrow or render fat. At others, they've found burned plant remains, including what might be cooked seeds and tubers. The evidence is fragmentary, as archaeological evidence from 1 million years ago always is, but it suggests people who knew how to use fire for food processing. Fire also changes the tools you can make. Heat treatment of stone improves its flaking properties. Flint or obsidian that's been carefully heated becomes easier to work, produces sharper edges, makes better tools. Some researchers have found evidence of heat-treated stones at sites occupied by Homo erectus, suggesting they understood this principle. Fire hardening of wooden spears makes them more durable and deadly. No wooden spears from early Homo erectus sites have survived, wood being organic and prone to decay, but later human species definitely fire-hardened their spears. It's reasonable to assume Homo erectus did too. And there's a social dimension to fire that's harder to quantify, but potentially just as important. A hearth is a gathering place. It's where the group comes together at the end of the day, where food is shared, where children are taught, where stories are told. Some anthropologists think fire might have been crucial for the development of complex language. Around the fire in the extended evening hours, there's time and safety for long, complex communications, for teaching the accumulated knowledge of the group to the next generation, for social bonding that strengthens group cohesion. Modern hunter-gatherers spend considerable time around fires, and anthropologists have documented the social functions this serves. It's not just about warmth or cooking, it's about community. The fire is where decisions are made, disputes are resolved, relationships are maintained. If Homo erectus had even a fraction of this fire-centered social behavior, it would have been a powerful force for maintaining stable groups and transmitting culture across generations. But controlling fire isn't easy. It requires knowledge, attention, and planning. You need to know what burns well and what doesn't. Different woods burn at different temperatures, produce different amounts of smoke, create different types of coals. You need to know how to keep a fire going without letting it burn out or get out of control. You need to understand that fire requires fuel, oxygen, and heat, even if you don't have those specific words for the concepts. You need to protect fire from rain and wind. You need to transport it when your group moves. Some researchers think Homo erectus could create fire, could actually start it from scratch using friction or striking stones. Others think they only maintained fire, scavenging it from natural sources and keeping it alive as they moved. The truth is, we don't know. Creating fire from scratch requires sophisticated understanding of materials and techniques. It's difficult even when you know how. Did Homo erectus figure it out? Maybe. But even just maintaining fire requires considerable skill and knowledge. Think about what's involved in keeping a fire alive long term. You need to feed it constantly but not smother it. You need to protect the coals even when you're not actively burning. You need to be able to transport fire when you move camp, carrying embers in some protected container. You need backups, multiple fire sources, so if one goes out you're not left desperate. This is complex, knowledge-intensive work, but if you succeed, if you keep fire alive, you gain abilities that no other animal possesses. And here's the crucial thing. Once Homo erectus had fire, it changed where they could go. The spread of Homo erectus into temperate zones correlates with evidence of fire use. The earliest populations, the ones in Africa and tropical Asia, might have survived without fire. But the populations that pushed into northern China, possibly into Europe, they needed fire. Without it, they would have frozen during winter. Fire was the key technology that let them expand beyond their original tropical range. At Dmanisi in Georgia, at the gateway between Africa and Eurasia, Homo erectus fossils date to about 1.8 million years ago. This is a temperate zone with cold winters. Did they have fire? The evidence isn't clear, but they survived somehow in an environment that would be challenging for a hairless primate without external heat sources. Either they had fire, or they had some other adaptation we haven't identified, or the climate was significantly warmer then than later. The puzzle remains unsolved. What we do know is that by 500,000 years ago, fire use was definitely widespread. Sites across Africa, Asia, and possibly Europe show clear evidence of hearths, burned materials, and organized fire management. Homo erectus had mastered this technology. They'd figured out how to make it work for them in diverse environments, and this mastery gave them a survival advantage that helped them persist for so long. But there's something poignant about this story. Homo erectus controlled fire for potentially 1 million years or more. They used it, depended on it, structured their lives around it, but they never seem to have innovated much beyond basic fire use. There's no evidence of ceramics, of using fire to transform materials. No evidence of sophisticated pottery or metallurgy, though those technologies were far in the future. Their use of fire was practical, straightforward, conservative. They found what worked and stuck with it. And maybe that's part of the lesson. They didn't need constant innovation. They didn't need to push fire technology to new heights. They needed reliable warmth, light, protection, and cooked food. Fire provided all of that. The technology was sufficient. And so for 1 million years or more, it remained essentially unchanged. Different groups in different places all using fire in broadly similar ways. No explosion of fire-based innovation. Just steady, reliable use of a tool that kept them alive. We modern humans have fire, too, of course, but we took it much further. We used fire to smelt metals, to create ceramics, to power engines, to generate electricity. We've pushed fire technology in directions Homo erectus never imagined. But have those innovations made us more survivable? Or have they made us dependent on complex systems that could fail? Homo erectus kept it simple. They kept fires burning for warmth and cooking, and they survived for 2 million years. There's something extraordinary about standing at the site of Dmanisi in the Republic of Georgia and trying to imagine what it looked like 1.8 million years ago. This location, on the southern slopes of the Caucasus Mountains, is about 4,000 miles from East Africa as the crow flies, much farther if you're walking, following coastlines and river valleys, avoiding mountains and deserts and other obstacles. And yet, by 1.8 million years ago, Homo erectus was here, living, thriving, raising children in a landscape completely different from their African homeland. This wasn't a casual journey. This was the first time any human species left Africa, the first time our lineage ventured into truly unknown territory, into ecosystems they'd never encountered, with unfamiliar animals and plants and climate patterns, and they succeeded. The fossils from Dmanisi include multiple individuals, old and young, suggesting a viable breeding population, not just a few lost wanderers. These people were established, settled, making a life in a new world. How did they get there? Not in a single migration, certainly, not as some organized expedition with a destination in mind. The dispersal of Homo erectus out of Africa was probably a slow, gradual process playing out over hundreds of thousands of years. A process where no individual ever knew they were part of something historic. They were just people following game, exploring new territories, moving when resources became scarce or populations became too dense. Generation after generation, they expanded their range. And eventually some of their descendants found themselves thousands of miles from where the species had begun. Imagine you're part of that expansion. You're born in a small group of maybe 30 or 40 individuals living somewhere in East Africa. You grow up learning the landscape, the water sources, the seasonal movements of game animals. When you're an adult, your group splits because resources are getting stretched. Some people stay, some move on. You go with the group that's moving. You travel maybe 50 miles and find a new territory with water and game. You settle. You have children. They grow up and eventually their group splits too. Some stay, some move on. Over generations, this process repeats. No one is trying to reach Georgia or China or Java. They're just moving into the next valley, the next watershed, the next available territory. But movement adds up. If each generation moves an average of just 50 miles from where their parents lived, in 20 generations, you've covered 1,000 miles. In 100 generations, 5,000 miles. At a population growth rate of even 1% per year, you'd need to expand into new territories constantly just to accommodate the growing population. And Homo erectus had tens of thousands of generations. The math works out. Given enough time, gradual expansion following no particular plan could carry them across continents. The route probably followed coastlines and major rivers. These are areas where resources are predictable and abundant. Water is always available. Fish and shellfish provide protein. Game animals come to drink. Plant foods grow in the fertile soils near water. Modern humans, when they later dispersed out of Africa, followed similar routes. The genetics suggest coastal migration paths, staying near water, avoiding harsh interior environments until populations were large and confident enough to push inland. From East Africa, groups probably moved north into the Nile Valley, then into the Levant. From there, some turned west into Europe, though whether Homo erectus actually reached Europe is debated. Others moved east into Mesopotamia, then north into the Caucasus where Dmanisi sits. Others went south and east, following the coastlines of the Arabian Peninsula and the Indian subcontinent. And somehow, by 1.6 million years ago, they'd reached Java in Southeast Asia, an island separated from the mainland by water. That last bit is remarkable. How did Homo erectus cross water barriers? Did they build rafts? Did they accidentally drift on natural vegetation rafts after storms? Did sea levels drop enough during glacial periods to create land bridges that later flooded? We don't know. But they reached islands, multiple islands actually, Flores, where the dwarf species Homo floresiensis would later evolve, possibly other islands in Southeast Asia. Accidental rafting on debris after storms is the usual explanation. Not intentional voyaging, just bad luck that sometimes turned into colonization. But it required surviving the crossing, landing somewhere habitable, and establishing a breeding population. Lucky accidents perhaps, but repeatedly successful ones. The fossil sites tell the story of this spread. In Georgia at Dmanisi, we have multiple individuals dating to between 1.8 and 1.77 million years ago. They're small-brained and somewhat primitive-looking compared to later Homo erectus, leading some researchers to argue they should be a separate species, Homo georgicus. But most experts now consider them early Homo erectus, showing the anatomical variation we'd expect in such a widespread, long-lived species. In Java, the fossil sites of Sangiran and Mojokerto have yielded Homo erectus remains dating from 1.6 million years ago up until possibly 100,000 years ago, over 1.5 million years of continuous habitation on a tropical island. These populations seem to have remained relatively isolated, developing some unique characteristics while retaining the overall Homo erectus body plan. The latest specimens, sometimes called Homo erectus soloensis, show robust builds and thick skull bones, adaptations to local conditions developed over enormous spans of time. In China, the famous Zhoukoudian cave site near Beijing preserved Peking man, Homo erectus fossils dating from around 700,000 years ago to 200,000 years ago. These populations lived through multiple glacial cycles, enduring conditions far colder than anything their African ancestors had experienced. The cave itself provided shelter, but they still needed fire, warm clothing made from animal skins, and sophisticated knowledge of their environment to survive winters that could kill an unprepared human in hours. But here's what's striking. Despite being spread across Africa, Asia, and possibly Europe, despite living in radically different environments from tropical islands to temperate forests to seasonal grasslands, Homo erectus remained recognizably the same species. There was regional variation, certainly. Asian populations had some features that African populations didn't, but the overall pattern held. Same basic body proportions, same general skull shape, same approach to tool-making. For a species spread across the Old World for over 1 million years, that's remarkable homogeneity. Modern humans, by comparison, have been spread worldwide for less than 100,000 years, and we show considerable variation in features like skin color, hair texture, facial features, and body build. Yet we're all clearly the same species. Homo erectus maintained even greater uniformity over a much longer time span. What does that tell us? Possibly that their populations stayed in contact, at least occasionally, that groups weren't isolated long enough to diverge significantly, or possibly that they faced similar selective pressures across their range, maintaining similar adaptations even in different environments. The climate they encountered varied enormously. Tropical rainforests in Java with year-round warmth and monsoon rains, temperate deciduous forests in northern China with distinct seasons, grasslands and savannas in Africa with wet and dry seasons, Mediterranean climates in the Levant with hot, dry summers and cool, wet winters. Each environment required different survival strategies, different knowledge of local plants and animals, different timing for hunting and gathering activities. But they adapted. In Java, they hunted species that existed nowhere else: stegodon, an extinct relative of elephants, giant pangolins, local deer species. They learned which tropical plants were edible, which were poisonous, which had medicinal properties. In China, they endured winters, stockpiling food, managing fire, finding or creating shelter. In Africa, they dealt with the largest assemblage of predators on Earth. Lions, leopards, hyenas, wild dogs, all competing for the same prey animals that Homo erectus hunted. And they succeeded in all these places. Not just survived, thrived. Populations persisted for hundreds of thousands of years in each major region. They weren't barely hanging on. They were established, confident, knowing their environments well enough to exploit them efficiently. Archaeological sites show repeated occupation, suggesting groups return to productive locations season after season, generation after generation. That's not the pattern of desperate refugees. That's the pattern of people who know what they're doing. The dispersal also tells us something about their social organization. Maintaining a species across such vast distances requires successful reproduction, child rearing, and knowledge transmission in all regions. If any population failed to raise enough children to reproductive age, that branch would die out. But Homo erectus populations persisted everywhere they established themselves. They were successful parents in tropical heat and temperate cold, in familiar African landscapes and strange Asian ones. This suggests robust social systems, adults capable of cooperating to defend and feed children, knowledge systems capable of transmitting survival information across generations, children capable of learning complex skills, group cohesion strong enough to maintain populations through hard times. None of this is easy. Social carnivores like wolves and lions manage it, but they have millions of years of evolution fine-tuning their behaviors. Homo erectus developed these capabilities relatively quickly in evolutionary terms, then maintained them across wildly different environments for 2 million years. There's also something we don't know that matters enormously. Were Homo erectus populations in different regions in contact with each other? Did groups in Africa know about groups in Asia? Was there any exchange of people, genes, or information across their range? Or were they isolated into regional populations that barely interacted? The archaeology can't tell us definitively. The pattern of tool use suggests some information exchange, as similar tool technologies appear across their range at roughly similar times. But that could also be independent invention of similar solutions to similar problems. What we do know is that they persisted in all these places until eventually they didn't. Different populations went extinct at different times. The African populations seem to have evolved into later human species or been replaced by them. The Asian populations persisted longer, with the Java population surviving until possibly 100,000 years ago or later. Each regional extinction probably had local causes: climate change, competition with other human species, disease, bad luck. But taken together, these extinctions mark the end of the most successful human species that ever lived. Yet their legacy remained, because some Homo erectus populations were ancestral to later human species. Homo heidelbergensis, which appeared around 700,000 years ago, was probably descended from Homo erectus, and Homo heidelbergensis was ancestral to both Neanderthals and modern humans. We're not directly descended from the late surviving Asian Homo erectus, but we're descended from earlier African Homo erectus who evolved into something new. Their genes flow through us. Their adaptations shaped our bodies. Their dispersal patterns set the stage for later human migrations. The long walk across the world wasn't planned. It wasn't deliberate expansion with maps and destinations. It was just people living, moving, surviving, generation after generation after generation. But the cumulative effect was extraordinary. A species that started in one small region of East Africa eventually occupied a territory stretching from South Africa to Indonesia to northern China. Millions of square miles, dozens of different ecosystems, hundreds of thousands of years of continuous presence. And they did it with stone tools, fire, and their wits. No agriculture, no domesticated animals, no permanent settlements, just small groups moving across landscapes, learning as they went, adapting to whatever they encountered. It's one of the great success stories in the history of life on Earth, and it's all the more impressive because they did it so long ago when they were still figuring out what it meant to be human. Here's something we, modern humans, rarely think about. The climate we've lived in for the past 12,000 years, since the end of the last ice age, is abnormally stable. Remarkably, bizarrely stable. Temperatures have fluctuated, certainly. We've had the medieval warm period and the Little Ice Age and various other regional climate variations. But compared to what came before, compared to the Pleistocene epoch when Homo erectus lived, our Holocene climate has been tranquil, boring even. And that stability is what allowed us to develop agriculture and civilization and everything that came with it. Homo erectus didn't have that luxury. They lived through the Pleistocene, a period of dramatic, violent climate swings that would terrify anyone who's worried about modern climate change. Ice ages that locked up so much water in glaciers that sea levels dropped 400 feet. Interglacial warm periods that melted the ice and flooded coastlines. Shifts between these extremes that sometimes happened within just a few thousand years. rapid enough that a single human lifetime might span major climate transitions. And this wasn't a one-time event. It happened over and over and over again for 2 million years. Let's talk about what an ice age actually means. We tend to think of it as just colder, maybe some extra snow. That's not even close. During glacial maxima, ice sheets up to 2 miles thick covered Canada, northern Europe, and parts of northern Asia. 2 miles of ice. The weight of it pressed the land surface down, deforming the Earth's crust. Meltwater from summer thaws created vast lakes at the edges of glaciers. When ice dams failed, these lakes burst out in catastrophic floods that carved enormous channels in bedrock and carried boulders the size of houses hundreds of miles. But it wasn't just the glaciated regions that changed. The ice locked up so much water that global sea levels dropped dramatically. Coastlines extended miles or even hundreds of miles beyond their current positions. Shallow seas became dry land. Islands became connected to continents. The geography of the world was fundamentally different. Places that are now underwater were grasslands or forests. Channels that are now necessary sea routes were land bridges that animals and humans could walk across. And the climate patterns shifted. With so much ice covering the northern continents, atmospheric circulation changed. The jet stream moved, rainfall patterns transformed. Deserts appeared in places that had been lush. Grasslands spread where forests had been. The Sahara, which today is the world's largest hot desert, went through multiple cycles of expansion and contraction. During glacial periods, it expanded enormously, becoming an even more formidable barrier. During interglacials, it shrank, and what's now desert was savanna with lakes and rivers and abundant wildlife. Homo erectus lived through all of this, multiple times. The Pleistocene epoch saw at least 11 major glacial cycles during the time Homo erectus existed. 11 times the ice advanced and retreated. 11 times sea levels dropped and rose. 11 times the entire global climate system reorganized itself. And Homo erectus populations, spread across Africa and Asia, had to adapt to these massive changes or die. Think about what this means on the ground. You're living in a region that's currently grassland. It's dry, seasonal, but predictable. You know where the water sources are, where game concentrates during different seasons, which plants are edible. Your entire cultural knowledge is built around this environment. Then over a period of a few thousand years, maybe faster, everything changes. The rains shift, water sources dry up, the game animals you depend on migrate away or go extinct. New species you've never encountered move in. The grassland becomes desert or forest or something in between. Your choices are adapt or move or die, and Homo erectus populations did all three, in different places at different times. Some adapted, changing their diet, their hunting strategies, their seasonal movements. Some moved, following the environments they knew into new regions as climate shifted. And some died, populations going extinct when conditions changed too drastically or too quickly for them to adjust. But as a species they survived. That's the remarkable thing. Despite regional extinctions, despite population crashes, despite repeated environmental catastrophes, Homo erectus as a whole persisted. Populations in different regions acted as reserves. When conditions got terrible in one area, populations in other areas kept going. When climate improved in the devastated region, people could move back in, recolonizing from surviving populations elsewhere. And the temperature swings were extreme. During glacial maxima, global average temperatures were about 8 to 10 degrees Celsius colder than today. That doesn't sound like much until you realize what it means. Tropical regions that are currently warm year-round became seasonal, with actual winter cold snaps. Temperate regions became subarctic. Places that are marginally habitable now became utterly uninhabitable. The productive zone where humans could live shifted toward the equator, compressing populations into smaller areas with increased competition for resources. During interglacials, temperatures sometimes reached or even exceeded modern levels. The Eemian interglacial about 120,000 years ago saw global temperatures perhaps 1 degree Celsius warmer than today. That was enough to melt significant portions of the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets. Sea levels rose 20 to 30 feet higher than current levels. Coastlines that had been home to Homo erectus populations for tens of thousands of years vanished underwater. Again, adapt, move, or die. The speed of these changes varied. Some transitions happened relatively slowly by human standards, taking thousands of years to complete. Populations could adjust gradually, moving with the changing climate zones, adapting to new conditions over many generations. But other transitions were rapid. There's evidence of abrupt climate shifts where temperatures change by several degrees within just decades. A single human lifetime could span dramatic environmental transformation. The knowledge your grandparents taught you about surviving in one type of climate might become useless before you died. And then there were the catastrophes, volcanic eruptions that injected massive amounts of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, creating volcanic winters. The eruption of Toba in Sumatra about 74,000 years ago, long after most Homo erectus populations had gone extinct, but while late survivors still persisted in Java, was the largest volcanic eruption in the past 2 million years. It ejected thousands of cubic kilometers of rock and ash. The sulfur dioxide created a volcanic winter that might have dropped global temperatures by several degrees for years. Did this event contribute to the final extinction of Homo erectus in Java? Possibly. The timing is close enough that it's suspicious. But even if Toba didn't finish them off, it's just one example of the kind of catastrophe that happened repeatedly during the Pleistocene. Other supervolcanic eruptions, not as large as Toba but still massive, regional volcanic events that devastated local populations, impact events from asteroids or comets, though none as large as the one that killed the dinosaurs. Each of these would have been an existential crisis for human populations unlucky enough to be nearby. Yet Homo erectus persisted through all of it. How? Part of the answer is geographic distribution. Being spread across Africa and Asia meant that no single regional catastrophe could wipe out the entire species. When Toba erupted, Homo erectus populations thousands of miles away might not even have noticed beyond slightly unusual weather. When glaciers advanced in northern China, populations in tropical Java were unaffected. The species-wide distribution was insurance against localized extinctions. But part of the answer is also flexibility. Homo erectus wasn't specialized for one particular environment or lifestyle. They could hunt, but they could also gather and scavenge. They could live in forests or grasslands or near water. They could tolerate heat and, with fire, cold. They were generalists, capable of surviving in whatever conditions they encountered. This flexibility meant that when climate changed, they didn't need to evolve new adaptations. They could adjust behaviorally, changing what they ate, where they lived, how they obtained food. Modern hunter-gatherers show this kind of flexibility. The Hadza of Tanzania hunt large game when it's available, but survive primarily on plant foods and honey during dry seasons. The Inuit of the Arctic hunt marine mammals and fish, with almost no plant foods in their diet. The San of the Kalahari gather hundreds of different plant species and hunt opportunistically. All are human populations surviving in radically different environments using flexibility rather than specialization. Homo erectus probably operated similarly, adjusting to local conditions while maintaining the general pattern of human behavior. But there were costs. Population sizes probably fluctuated wildly. During favorable climate periods, abundant resources would have allowed populations to grow. During harsh periods, starvation and disease would have cut populations back. Genetic studies of modern humans show evidence of population bottlenecks, times when our species nearly went extinct. Homo erectus probably experienced similar bottlenecks, maybe more severe, definitely more numerous over their 2 million year run. These bottlenecks matter for evolution. Small populations lose genetic diversity. Random genetic drift becomes more important than natural selection. Beneficial mutations might be lost just by chance. Harmful mutations might become fixed in the population. Each bottleneck was a crisis, a time when the species' long-term survival hung in the balance. And they survived enough of these crises to last 2 million years, but each one reduced their resilience slightly, made them a bit more vulnerable to the next crisis. The archaeological record shows this pattern. Sites show repeated occupation, then abandonment, then reoccupation much later. This is the signature of populations responding to climate change, living in an area during favorable times, leaving when conditions deteriorate, returning when they improve. Some regions might have been abandoned for thousands or even tens of thousands of years between occupations. The people didn't go extinct, they just moved to wherever conditions were better. But this constant movement prevented the development of deep, place-specific knowledge that comes from continuous occupation. Modern humans survived similar climate challenges during the late Pleistocene, the period from about 130,000 years ago to 12,000 years ago that included the most recent ice age. We nearly went extinct several times. Genetic evidence suggests that around 70,000 years ago something reduced the human population to perhaps as few as 10,000 breeding pairs. Maybe it was Toba, maybe it was climate change, maybe it was disease, we don't know, but we survived by the skin of our teeth. Homo erectus survived dozens of similar crises over their much longer existence. Each time, populations crashed. Each time, survivors persisted somewhere and eventually repopulated devastated regions. It's remarkable resilience, but it's also exhausting. Constant adaptation to changing conditions, repeated population crashes and recoveries, the long-term stress of living in an unpredictably dangerous world. Eventually something had to give, and eventually it did. Different Homo erectus populations went extinct at different times, probably for different reasons. But the overall pattern is clear. They survived for nearly 2 million years, through countless climate disasters, and then they were gone. The last populations, isolated on Java, survived until sometime between 117,000 and 108,000 years ago, possibly later. They outlasted almost all other human species, but they couldn't outlast everything. We modern humans are now facing climate change of our own making. The changes we're causing are rapid, potentially as rapid as some of the worst Pleistocene climate shifts. But we're causing them during a period that should be climatically stable. We're pushing the Earth system out of the comfortable Holocene equilibrium into something unknown. And unlike Homo erectus, we're not generalists living in small, flexible groups. We're specialists depending on agriculture, technology, and complex social systems. Systems that require stability to function. Can we survive what's coming? Probably. We're clever, adaptable, capable of deliberate planning in ways Homo erectus never was. But will we survive for 2 million years? That's the real question. The standard Homo erectus set. The benchmark for genuine long-term survival. We're 300,000 years in. We have a very long way to go to match their achievement. Here's something that should terrify you if you think about it too long. During the entire existence of Homo erectus, roughly 2 million years, the Earth's climate was cycling through extremes that would destroy modern civilization within decades. Ice ages that locked up so much water in glaciers that sea levels dropped 400 feet. Interglacial warm periods where temperatures spiked higher than today. Transitions between these extremes that happened over just a few thousand years, which is nothing in evolutionary time but is catastrophically fast for any species trying to adapt. And Homo erectus lived through all of it. Not once, not twice, multiple times. The Pleistocene epoch, when Homo erectus existed, was characterized by repeated glacial cycles. Ice sheets advancing from the poles, covering vast territories in miles-thick ice, then retreating, melting away over thousands of years, only to return again. Each cycle lasted roughly 100,000 years. During Homo erectus's 2 million year existence, they experienced about 20 complete glacial cycles. 20 times the world froze, 20 times it thawed, 20 times ecosystems were completely rearranged. Let's try to understand what that actually means. During glacial periods, ice sheets covered much of northern Europe, northern Asia, and northern North America. Ice up to 2 miles thick. The weight of this ice pressed down on the continental crust, actually deforming the Earth itself. Temperatures dropped by an average of about 8 to 10 degrees Celsius globally. But regional variations were more extreme. Northern latitudes became uninhabitable. The ice didn't just make things cold, it destroyed everything beneath it, scraping away soil, crushing vegetation, grinding bedrock into dust. But Homo erectus wasn't living in northern Europe or Canada. They were in Africa, southern Asia, tropical islands. So why should they care about ice sheets thousands of miles away? Because the climate is connected. When the poles freeze, the entire planet's weather patterns change. The jet streams shift. Monsoons weaken or fail entirely. Rainfall patterns transform. Regions that were lush and productive become arid. Grasslands turn to desert. Forests die back or migrate to new latitudes. The animals that Homo erectus hunted moved, died out, or evolved into different forms. The plants they gathered appeared and disappeared with the changing conditions. And these weren't gradual changes. The transitions between glacial and interglacial periods could happen over just a few thousand years. One human lifespan wouldn't see the full transition, but over a few generations the world would transform. Your grandparents' hunting territories might become desert or be swallowed by forest. Water sources your parents relied on might dry up. Game animals might migrate away and never return. You'd have to adapt or die. And Homo erectus adapted 20 times over. But it gets worse. Within each glacial cycle, there were shorter-term fluctuations. Periods called stadials and interstadials, where the climate would suddenly cool or warm for a few thousand years before reversing. These were whiplash changes, fast enough that ecosystems couldn't fully adjust. Species that adapted to cooling would find themselves maladapted when warming returned. And through all this instability, Homo erectus populations maintained themselves. The ice core records from Antarctica and Greenland preserve this history in exquisite detail. Scientists can drill down through miles of ice, extracting cores that contain bubbles of ancient atmosphere, dust from ancient winds, isotopes that record ancient temperatures. The story these cores tell is of a planet in constant flux. Temperature swings that make our current climate concerns look modest by comparison. Carbon dioxide levels that fluctuated wildly, methane levels that spiked and crashed. The Pleistocene was climatically unstable in ways the current Holocene epoch has not been. We modern humans have lived our entire existence during the tail end of the Pleistocene and the beginning of the Holocene. The Holocene started about 11,700 years ago and is characterized by remarkable climate stability. Warm, but not too warm. Cold, but not too cold. Predictable patterns of rainfall and temperature. This stability allowed agriculture to develop, civilizations to form, populations to grow dense enough for cities and states, and all the complexity of modern life. We've never had to deal with the climate chaos of the Pleistocene. But Homo erectus did. They lived through the worst of it, and they didn't have agriculture to fall back on. They couldn't store grain for bad years. They couldn't domesticate animals to provide reliable protein. They couldn't build permanent settlements with stockpiled resources. They were hunter-gatherers, dependent on wild resources that could disappear if the climate shifted. Yet they survived, generation after generation, through conditions that would destroy modern societies. Consider what happened during severe glacial periods. With so much water locked up in ice, sea levels dropped dramatically. The world's coastlines extended far beyond where they are today. Shallow seas became dry land. Islands became connected to continents. The map of the world looked completely different. For Homo erectus populations living near coasts, this meant their territories were constantly shifting. Areas that had been productive fishing grounds became dry plains. New territories emerged from the receding seas. They had to constantly adjust their mental maps of the world, but they also had advantages we lack. Lower sea levels meant land bridges. The Bering Strait became a grassland corridor connecting Asia and North America. The Sunda Shelf, now covered by the Java Sea, became a vast lowland plain connecting the Indonesian islands to mainland Asia. The Persian Gulf was a river valley. The English Channel didn't exist. Homo erectus could walk to places that are now only reachable by boat. This, probably, facilitated their dispersal, allowing them to reach islands and isolated regions that would be cut off during interglacial high sea levels. And there were other climate catastrophes beyond the glacial cycles. Volcanic eruptions. The Toba supervolcano in Sumatra erupted about 74,000 years ago, near the end of Homo erectus's time. This was one of the largest volcanic eruptions in the past 2 million years. It ejected thousands of cubic kilometers of rock into the atmosphere, creating a volcanic winter that might have lasted years. Global temperatures dropped. Ash covered vast regions of Asia. Some scientists think this eruption nearly drove Homo sapiens extinct, reducing our population to perhaps 10,000 individuals. But the evidence suggests Homo erectus populations in Southeast Asia survived it. They were close to the eruption, covered in volcanic ash, and they made it through. Other supervolcanic eruptions occurred during the Pleistocene. The Yellowstone supervolcano erupted multiple times. Volcanic eruptions in Indonesia, New Zealand, and elsewhere pumped sulfur and ash into the atmosphere, cooling the climate temporarily but dramatically. Each of these events would have stressed ecosystems, killed vegetation, disrupted food chains. But Homo erectus populations persisted through all of them. Droughts were another constant threat. When the climate shifted, rainfall patterns changed. Regions that normally received monsoon rains might go years without significant precipitation. Water sources dried up, vegetation died, animals migrated or died. For a human population dependent on local resources, this was catastrophic. But Homo erectus had mobility. They could follow the rain, track the animals to wherever water remained. They weren't tied to specific locations. This nomadic flexibility was a survival advantage when the climate was unstable. But there were limits. Some populations surely died out when conditions became too harsh. Local extinctions must have happened repeatedly. A group living in a region that became uninhabitable, unable to move fast enough or far enough to reach better conditions. Children starving when food sources failed. Elderly dying in harsh winters. Population crashes that reduced groups to unsustainable levels. These local failures are invisible in the fossil record. We only see the populations that survived, that made it through the bottlenecks, that persisted long enough to leave fossils. The genetic evidence from modern humans suggests our species went through severe population bottlenecks. Times when we were reduced to small, isolated populations that nearly went extinct. Homo erectus probably experienced similar events, but they recovered. They rebuilt their populations. They spread again into territories they'd previously abandoned. And they did this repeatedly over 2 million years. Each recovery proves they had the resilience, the knowledge, and the social cohesion to bounce back from disaster. The megafauna extinctions complicate the picture. During the Pleistocene, many large mammal species went extinct. Woolly mammoths, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, and dozens of others. Some of these extinctions were probably climate-driven. Species adapted to cold conditions couldn't survive when the climate warmed. Species adapted to forests couldn't survive when forests turned to grasslands. But humans probably played a role too. Homo erectus was hunting large animals for hundreds of thousands of years. They might have contributed to some extinctions, though the evidence is limited. But here's the key point. When megafauna went extinct, Homo erectus adapted. They switched to different prey. They relied more on plant foods. They adjusted their hunting strategies. They didn't collapse when their traditional prey disappeared. This dietary flexibility was crucial for long-term survival. Species that specialize in one food source are vulnerable when that source disappears. Generalists who can eat many things survive environmental changes better. The archaeological evidence shows technological conservatism throughout Homo erectus's existence. Their stone tools remained relatively simple and unchanged for over 1 million years. To us, this looks like lack of innovation. But maybe it was wisdom. They'd found tools that worked in diverse environments for diverse purposes. Why change what works? Technological conservatism might have been a stabilizing force, preventing populations from becoming dependent on specialized tools that would fail if conditions changed. Cultural flexibility within that technological conservatism was probably key. Different populations adapted their behavior to local conditions while maintaining the same basic toolkit. Groups in tropical forests hunted different animals and gathered different plants than groups on temperate grasslands. But they used similar stone tools, similar fire management techniques, similar social organizations. This combination of technological stability and behavioral flexibility created resilience, and they must have had remarkable environmental knowledge. To survive 20 glacial cycles, you need to understand your environment deeply, know which plants are edible in each season, know where animals migrate, know where water can be found, even in drought, know which caves provide good shelter, know which materials burn well. This knowledge had to be transmitted from generation to generation, preserved through oral tradition, demonstrated through example. Loss of this knowledge would be fatal. Modern humans almost lost this kind of knowledge. We became dependent on agriculture, on stored food, on permanent settlements. We forgot most of the hunter-gatherer skills our ancestors possessed. If our technological civilization collapsed, most of us would starve within weeks because we don't know how to find wild food, hunt animals, or survive without grocery stores. Homo erectus never had, that problem. Their knowledge was directly tied to survival. Every generation had to learn it or die. The Pleistocene climate cycles are accelerating again. We're in an interglacial warm period now, but if the pattern holds, another ice age should be starting soon in geological terms. Except it might not, because we've pumped so much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that we might have postponed the next glaciation. We've accidentally hacked the climate system, and we don't fully understand the consequences. The stable Holocene climate that allowed civilization might be ending. We might be heading into a period of instability more like the Pleistocene that Homo erectus endured. But we're not prepared like they were. We depend on climate stability for agriculture. Our cities are built on coastlines that would flood if sea levels rose, or be stranded far inland if sea levels dropped. Our infrastructure assumes tomorrow will be like today. We've lost the flexibility, the mobility, the environmental knowledge that kept Homo erectus alive through climate hell. They survived 2 million years of the worst climate instability in recent Earth history. We've survived 300,000 years of mostly moderate conditions. The test that broke lesser species repeatedly, Homo erectus passed 20 times. We haven't taken that test yet, and when we do, will we have the resilience they possessed? Or will our technological sophistication turn out to be a weakness when the climate stops cooperating with our assumptions? So let's talk about us, Homo sapiens, the species that thinks it's conquered the planet, the ones with the biggest brains, the most complex language, the most sophisticated technology. We've been here for roughly 300,000 years, give or take, depending on how you define the emergence of our species. 300,000 years sounds impressive. It's longer than recorded history by a factor of 30. It's long enough that the people at the beginning of our species' existence would have looked anatomically almost identical to us but lived in a world we can barely comprehend. But 300,000 years is nothing compared to Homo erectus. We're about 15% of the way to matching their longevity. We're still in the early chapters of our story if we're lucky enough to have a long story, and the uncomfortable truth is that for most of our existence, we've been barely hanging on. We weren't dominant. We weren't inevitable. We were one hominin species among several, struggling to survive in a world that didn't care whether we made it or not. The earliest fossils that might represent Homo sapiens come from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, dated to about 315,000 years ago. They're strange specimens, these early members of our species. They have faces that look modern, tucked under the brain case rather than projecting forward. But their skulls are elongated, not the high, rounded shape we associate with modern humans. Their brains were large, close to modern size, but shaped differently, suggesting the internal organization might have been different too. Were they us? Sort of. They were on the path to becoming us, but they weren't quite there yet. By 200,000 years ago, fossils from Homo kibish in Ethiopia show more clearly modern features. These people would have looked strange to us, archaic in subtle ways, but recognizably human. And by 100,000 years ago, humans from sites across Africa look anatomically modern. The same skull shape, the same facial features, the same skeletal proportions. If you dressed them in modern clothes, they'd blend into any contemporary city. The hardware was in place, but the software, the fully modern behavior that took longer to develop. And here's the thing. For most of our first 200,000 years, we stayed in Africa. We barely expanded our range beyond the continent where we evolved. There were some early attempts to leave. Fossils from Skul and Kafse caves in Israel, dating to around 100,000 to 90,000 years ago, show modern humans had reached the Levant. But these populations didn't spread further. They died out or retreated back to Africa. It wasn't until about 70,000 to 60,000 years ago that humans successfully dispersed out of Africa and colonized the rest of the world. Why the delay? Why did it take Homo sapiens 200,000 years to do what Homo erectus did in a few 100,000, spreading across the old world? We don't know for sure. Maybe earlier populations weren't behaviorally modern enough, didn't have the cultural toolkit necessary for successful colonization of diverse environments. Maybe they faced competition from established populations of other human species. Neanderthals were thriving in Europe and Western Asia. Denisovans occupied Eastern Asia. These weren't primitive ancestors. They were sophisticated, adapted, entrenched. Breaking into their territories wouldn't have been easy. Or maybe we were just unlucky. Maybe early dispersal attempts ran into bad climate, disease, hostile encounters with other species, or just random bad luck. Small populations are fragile. A few deaths from disease or violence or accident can eliminate an entire group. Early human populations outside Africa were probably tiny, a few hundred individuals at most, vulnerable to any number of disasters, and we nearly went extinct multiple times. The genetic evidence is clear on this. All humans alive today show remarkably low genetic diversity compared to other great apes. Chimpanzees, despite having much smaller total populations than humans, show far more genetic variation. Gorillas too. This low diversity suggests our population went through severe bottlenecks, periods when there were very few of us left. During these bottlenecks, most genetic lineages died out. We're all descended from the few that survived. The most famous, proposed bottleneck is associated with the Toba supervolcanic eruption 74,000 years ago. Some researchers argue this eruption nearly wiped out humanity, reducing us to perhaps 10,000 individuals or fewer. The genetic evidence shows a population crash around this time, but whether Toba caused it is debated. Other researchers point to climate change, disease, or other factors. The truth might be that multiple crises hit us around the same time. Toba erupted during a period of rapid cooling. Populations were already stressed. The eruption made things worse. Together, these factors nearly finished us. But we survived. Barely. The populations that made it through were probably concentrated in a few refugia, regions where conditions remained tolerable. East Africa, possibly. Southern Africa, where the coast provided reliable marine resources. Small groups hanging on while the rest of the world became temporarily uninhabitable. When conditions improved, these survivors expanded, repopulating devastated regions, eventually spreading beyond Africa to colonize the world. This pattern of near extinction followed by expansion might have happened multiple times during our early history. Each bottleneck left its signature in our genes. Each recovery required everything to go right. Resources to be available, populations to find each other and maintain viable breeding groups, knowledge to be transmitted to the next generation. Luck, in other words. And we got lucky enough times to survive. But it was close, much closer than we usually acknowledge. Even after we successfully dispersed out of Africa, our existence remained precarious. The populations that left Africa and colonized Eurasia were tiny. Recent genetic studies suggest the founding population that gave rise to all non-African humans might have numbered only a few thousand individuals. They encountered Neanderthals and interbred with them, acquiring genes that helped them survive in colder climates. They reached Australia by at least 65,000 years ago, crossing significant water barriers in one of humanity's most impressive feats of navigation and colonization. They reached the Americas, though the timing is debated, definitely by 15,000 years ago, possibly earlier. They spread to remote Pacific islands, mastering sophisticated navigation and carrying crops and animals with them. By 10,000 years ago, humans had occupied every major land mass except Antarctica. We'd become a global species, but we were still living as hunter-gatherers, still vulnerable to climate, disease, and all the other risks that come with being a wild species. Then something changed. About 12,000 years ago, as the last ice age ended, humans in the Levant began experimenting with agriculture, deliberately planting and harvesting wild grains, domesticating animals. Instead of following resources, they stayed in one place and made resources come to them. Agriculture emerged, independently in multiple regions: the Fertile Crescent, China, Mesoamerica, the Andes, West Africa, New Guinea. Each region domesticated different crops and animals, but the pattern was the same: sedentary life, food production, population growth. Agriculture changed everything. It allowed much larger populations than hunting and gathering ever could. It created food surpluses that could support non-food producing specialists, craftspeople, priests, warriors, administrators. It led to permanent settlements, then towns, then cities. It created social hierarchies, wealth inequality, organized warfare. It set us on the path to civilization, to everything we now associate with being human: writing, mathematics, art, architecture, science, technology. None of it would have been possible without agriculture. But agriculture also made us vulnerable in new ways. Hunter-gatherers are mobile and flexible. If local resources fail, you move. If one food source disappears, you switch to another. You're not invested in any particular place or crop, but farmers are tied to their fields. If the crops fail, you can't just move. Your entire investment, all your work is in that land. Drought, flood, disease, pests, any of these can destroy a harvest and leave a farming population starving. And because agriculture supports larger populations, when it fails, more people die. And farming creates dependencies. You're dependent on a few crops that need to succeed, dependent on stored food to get through seasons when nothing grows, dependent on trade networks to get resources you don't produce locally, dependent on social systems to organize the labor and distribution of food. Each dependency is a potential failure point. Hunter-gatherers have simple, robust systems. Farmers have complex, fragile ones. The archaeological record shows this. Early agricultural societies experienced frequent crises, collapses of local populations when harvests failed, migrations when climate changed, wars over productive land and water sources, boom and bust cycles driven by the productivity or failure of crops. Agriculture allowed human populations to grow much larger than hunting and gathering ever could. But it didn't make survival easier. It just changed the nature of the challenges, and agriculture kicked off population growth that continues to this day. By 10,000 years ago, the global human population was maybe 5 million. By 2,000 years ago, it was 300 million. By 1900, 1.6 billion. Today, 8 billion and growing. This population growth is unprecedented in mammalian history. We've increased our numbers by a factor of 1,600 in just 10,000 years. That's a blink in evolutionary time. But this growth has only been possible because of agriculture and the technological civilization it enabled. We're supporting 8 billion people on a planet that could probably support a few million hunter-gatherers sustainably. We're doing it through intensive agriculture, fossil fuels, global trade, and technology. Remove any of those pillars and the system collapses. Remove fossil fuels and we can't produce enough food. Remove global trade and regional populations starve. Remove technological agriculture and yields plummet. This is what makes modern humans so different from Homo erectus. They were generalists living within the planet's natural carrying capacity. We're specialists living far beyond it, sustained only by systems we've built and which require constant maintenance. They could lose fire or stone tools and still survive. It would be harder but possible. We lose electricity or global supply chains and billions die. Our complexity, our technological sophistication, it's made us powerful in the short term. But has it made us more survivable over the long term? We don't know yet. We're 300,000 years into our species' existence. For the first 290,000 of those years, we lived much like Homo erectus. Small groups, simple technology, following resources, adapting to local conditions. We survived climate change, volcanic eruptions, disease, competition with other human species. We nearly went extinct several times but pulled through. That's the part of our history that proves we can survive over deep time. But the last 10,000 years, since agriculture, we've been running a different experiment. Can civilization persist? Can a species that transforms its environment, that creates complex, interdependent systems, that grows to billions of individuals, survive for 2 million years? Or does complexity inherently create fragility? Homo erectus survived for 2 million years with barely any technological change. Their tools remained essentially the same for over 1 million years. Their lifestyle changed little. They found what worked and stuck with it. We've changed more in the last 100 years than they did in their entire existence. We've reshaped the planet, altered the climate, driven countless species extinct, created technologies that could destroy civilization in hours. We've accomplished things Homo erectus could never have imagined. But we haven't proven we can survive what we've created. The next few centuries will tell us whether intelligence is a genuine long-term survival trait, or just a short-term advantage that ultimately leads to self-destruction. We're facing climate change, ecological collapse, potential nuclear war, pandemics, artificial intelligence, and other existential risks we've created ourselves. Can we survive them? Probably. Humans are remarkably resilient. But can we survive them, and then survive for another 1 million years? Another 2 million to match Homo erectus? That's the question that should haunt us. We're 300,000 years in. We're not even close to proving we can match their achievement. We're the smart ones, the technological ones, the ones who conquered the planet. But Homo erectus was the survivor. And survival, over deep time, is the only thing that matters. Let's talk about us. Homo sapiens. The species that conquered the planet, built civilizations, walked on the moon, and split the atom. We're the pinnacle of evolution, right? The smartest, most advanced, most successful species that ever lived. Except by the one metric that actually matters in evolutionary terms, longevity, we're barely getting started. 300,000 years. That's our entire run so far. Homo erectus lasted nearly 7 times longer, and we're not even sure we'll make it to 400,000. The earliest fossils that look recognisably like modern humans come from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, dated to about 315,000 years ago. These people had faces that look modern, flat and tucked under the skull rather than projecting forward. But their skulls were still elongated, not yet the high, rounded brain case we have today. They were transitional, partway between more archaic humans and us. But they're close enough that most anthropologists consider them early Homo sapiens. By 200,000 years ago, we see more clearly modern fossils from Ethiopia. The Omo Kibish remains, found near the Omo River, show the full modern human form: high, rounded skulls, reduced brow ridges, chins, gracile skeletons without the heavy bone structure of earlier humans. These are people who, if you dressed them in modern clothes, wouldn't look out of place walking down a street today. Anatomically modern humans, present in Africa 200,000 years ago. But being anatomically modern didn't immediately translate to success. For the first 100,000 years of our existence, we were confined to Africa, a single continent. Homo erectus had spread across the old world within a few 100,000 years of appearing. We took longer, much longer, and during that time, we nearly went extinct, multiple times. The genetic evidence tells a story of population crashes that should terrify anyone who thinks about species survival. Around 70 to 80,000 years ago, something happened that reduced the human population dramatically. Different genetic studies give different numbers, but they all point to a severe bottleneck. Maybe as few as 10,000 individuals, maybe as few as a few thousand breeding pairs. For comparison, there are currently more than 8 billion humans. 70,000 years ago, there might have been fewer humans than there are endangered mountain gorillas today. What caused it? The honest answer is we don't know for certain. The timing coincides roughly with the eruption of Mount Toba in Sumatra, one of the largest volcanic eruptions in the past 2 million years. Some researchers think Toba caused a volcanic winter that devastated human populations. Others point out that archaeological evidence from Africa and India shows human activity continuing through the Toba period without obvious disruption. Maybe the bottleneck was caused by climate change unrelated to Toba. Maybe it was disease. Maybe it was a combination of factors we haven't identified. But whatever caused it, we nearly didn't make it. The genetic diversity of modern humans is remarkably low compared to most other primate species. Chimpanzees, despite having far smaller total populations than humans, have more genetic diversity. We're all descended from that small population that survived the bottleneck. We're all related more closely to each other than we might think. Every human alive today shares common ancestors who lived just a few tens of thousands of years ago. And the bottleneck might not have been unique. Some genetic analyses suggest multiple population crashes during our early history, times when human populations were reduced to tiny numbers, hanging on in isolated refugia, barely surviving. Each time we recovered, populations grew back, we spread into new territories, but each bottleneck was a close call. A few more deaths, a few fewer births, and we might not be here. Even after the bottleneck, even as populations recovered, we remained confined to Africa for tens of thousands of years. It wasn't until about 70 to 60,000 years ago that we finally dispersed out of Africa in significant numbers. Why then? What changed? Some researchers point to evidence of more sophisticated behaviour appearing in the archaeological record around this time. More complex tools, including composite tools made from multiple materials, systematic use of pigments for decoration or symbolic purposes, long-distance trade networks, possible evidence of symbolic thinking and complex language. Maybe these behavioural innovations gave us the edge we needed to successfully colonise the world beyond Africa. Or maybe we'd tried to leave before and failed, and 60,000 years ago was just when we finally got lucky. The archaeological record is sparse enough that we can't be certain. But leave we did, and once we started expanding, we moved fast. By 60,000 years ago, we were in the Middle East. By 50,000 years ago, we'd reached Australia, requiring sophisticated boats to cross significant water barriers. By 45,000 years ago, we were in Europe. By 15,000 years ago, we'd reached the Americas. Within 50,000 years, we'd spread from Africa to every continent except Antarctica. That's rapid by evolutionary standards. But it's also much later than Homo erectus managed. They were out of Africa by 1.8 million years ago. We took 240,000 years longer to make the same move, and our expansion came with costs. As we spread into new territories, other human species disappeared. Neanderthals had been living in Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. Within 10,000 years of modern humans arriving, they were gone. Denisovans, another human species known primarily from genetic evidence, disappeared around the same time. Homo floresiensis, the hobbit species on Flores Island, survived until perhaps 50,000 years ago. Then they vanished too. Did we kill them, outcompete them, interbreed with them until they were absorbed into our population? The answer is probably all of the above in different places and different circumstances. We know we interbred with Neanderthals and Denisovans. Most modern humans carry small percentages of Neanderthal DNA. Some populations have Denisovan DNA, so there was genetic mixing, but there was also replacement. By 40,000 years ago, we were the only human species left. After millions of years of multiple human species coexisting, suddenly there was only us. This should give us pause, because we didn't survive through being more robust or better adapted to harsh conditions. Neanderthals were tougher, more muscular, better adapted to Ice Age Europe. We survived through being more numerous, more socially connected, possibly more innovative. We overwhelmed other human species through sheer population size and technological sophistication. But those advantages only work in certain contexts. They require stable enough conditions to maintain large populations and complex social networks, and throughout our 300,000-year history, we've been dependent on favourable conditions. The development of agriculture around 12,000 years ago required climate stability. You can't farm successfully if rainfall patterns shift dramatically year to year. The rise of civilizations required predictable food surpluses. Cities require supply chains that deliver food from agricultural hinterlands. All of this depends on the remarkably stable Holocene climate that began 11,700 years ago. Before the Holocene, during the late Pleistocene when anatomically modern humans existed but lived as hunter-gatherers, we were probably more like Homo erectus. Small groups, mobile, flexible, able to survive through adaptation rather than through reshaping the environment. But once we developed agriculture, everything changed. We became dependent on specific crops, specific climates, specific ecological conditions. We became specialists rather than generalists, and specialists are vulnerable when conditions change. The archaeological record shows repeated collapses of agricultural societies. Drought brings down civilizations in Mesopotamia and the Maya lowlands and the Indus Valley. Crop failures cause famines that kill millions. Supply chain disruptions lead to urban collapse. These are regional disasters, not species-level threats, but they demonstrate our vulnerability. We've built a way of life that requires stability, and stability is not the norm in Earth's history. Modern industrial civilization is even more specialized and vulnerable. We depend on fossil fuels, on global supply chains, on technologies that require vast infrastructures to maintain. Break enough links in these chains and the whole system fails. We saw hints of this during the COVID-19 pandemic, when relatively minor disruptions to global trade created shortages and economic chaos. That was a mild preview. Real systemic collapse would be far worse, and we're now causing environmental changes that rival anything in the Pleistocene. Climate change driven by greenhouse gas emissions, the sixth mass extinction driven by habitat destruction and species exploitation, ocean acidification, plastic pollution, nuclear weapons capable of ending civilization in an afternoon. These are threats of our own making. Homo erectus never had to worry about destroying themselves. We do. Can we survive the next 300,000 years, the next million years, the next 2 million years to match Homo erectus's record? Honestly, it's hard to be optimistic. We're incredibly clever at solving short-term problems, but we're terrible at long-term thinking. We can't seem to coordinate globally to address existential threats. We're divided into competing nations, corporations, ideologies, and meanwhile, the climate is changing, ecosystems are collapsing, and we're still debating whether we should do anything about it. Homo erectus didn't have these advantages and disadvantages. They couldn't reshape the environment on a massive scale, but they also couldn't destroy themselves through their own cleverness. They lived within ecological limits because they had no choice. We've transcended those limits temporarily through technology. But transcending limits isn't the same as escaping them. Eventually, physics and ecology catch up, and when they do, our sophisticated civilization might turn out to be more fragile than Homo erectus's simple hunter-gatherer lifestyle. The comparison is humbling. 300,000 years versus 2 million years. We like to think we're the superior species, bigger brains, more complex technology, greater control over our environment. But by the only metric that evolution cares about, survival over deep time, we haven't proven anything yet. We're still in the early stages, still figuring out whether intelligence is a long-term survival advantage or a clever way to destroy ourselves. There's a concept in astrobiology called the Great Filter, the idea that there might be some barrier that prevents most species from achieving long-term survival. Maybe that barrier is nuclear war, maybe it's environmental collapse, maybe it's something we haven't thought of yet. But the filter hypothesis suggests that intelligence might be self-limiting, smart enough to develop dangerous technologies, not wise enough to use them responsibly. Homo erectus never faced that test. Their technologies were simple, sustainable, unable to threaten their own survival. They couldn't accidentally end themselves. The worst they could do was overexploit local resources, forcing them to move elsewhere. We can do much worse, and we're not sure we have the wisdom to avoid it, so here we are, 300,000 years into our existence, dominant on the planet in the short term, uncertain about the long term, facing challenges we created ourselves, and looking back at Homo erectus, our ancient relatives who lasted 2 million years with smaller brains and simpler tools, and wondering if they knew something we've forgotten. Here's a paradox that should trouble anyone who thinks deeply about human survival. The same trait that let us dominate the planet might be the thing that prevents us from lasting as long as Homo erectus. Intelligence, the ability to solve problems, to plan for the future, to reshape our environment to suit our needs. It's our defining characteristic. It's what makes us human. And it might be our fatal flaw. Homo erectus had brains averaging around 900 to 1100 cubic centimeters, depending on which population and time period you're looking at. Smaller than our 1400 cubic centimeter average, but still genuinely large for a primate. Large enough for complex thought, sophisticated tool use, social cooperation. They were intelligent. But they weren't as intelligent as us. They couldn't do abstract mathematics or written language or computer programming. Their cognitive abilities were more limited, and that limitation might have been an advantage. Because here's what intelligence does. It creates dependencies. The smarter you are, the more complex the systems you build, and the more complex the systems, the more things that can go wrong. Homo erectus kept things simple. Their tools were straightforward. Hand axes that did multiple jobs, cleavers for butchering, simple scrapers and choppers. You could make one with a few dozen strikes of stone on stone. You could learn the technique by watching someone else do it. No complex supply chains, no specialized tools that only work in specific contexts. Just robust, general-purpose implements that functioned well enough for everything they needed. Their lifestyle was similarly simple. Small groups, probably 30 to 50 individuals, extended families who knew each other intimately. No complex hierarchies requiring enforcement. No agricultural production requiring coordination of hundreds of workers. No cities requiring infrastructure for water, sewage, food distribution. Just people who moved when they needed to, found food where they could, cooperated because it was in everyone's obvious interest. The social complexity was manageable by human social cognition without need for complex institutions. We modern humans took a different path. We kept building on our intelligence, creating more and more complex solutions to problems. And each solution created new dependencies. Agriculture gave us reliable food supplies, but it also tied us to specific locations and made us dependent on specific crops. If those crops failed, we starved. Cities gave us specialization and trade and cultural flowering, but they also required massive infrastructure and made us dependent on supply chains. If the supply chains broke, cities collapsed. Writing let us transmit knowledge across generations with unprecedented fidelity, but it also created classes of literate and illiterate, concentrations of power, conflicts over control of information. Mathematics let us understand the natural world with precision, but it also gave us the tools to create weapons of mass destruction. Every intellectual advance brought new capabilities and new vulnerabilities. Modern industrial civilization is the culmination of this process. We've built a system of incredible complexity and capability. global supply chains that move goods across continents and oceans, communication networks that connect billions of people instantly, energy systems that harness fossil fuels and nuclear reactions and renewable sources to power our technological society, medical systems that extend lifespans and reduce suffering. All of this requires enormous intelligence to create and maintain, and all of it is fragile in ways that Homo erectus's lifestyle never was. Consider food. Homo erectus obtained food directly from their environment. They hunted, they gathered, they ate what they found or killed. If one food source failed, they switched to another. If an area became unproductive, they moved. The connection between effort and food was direct and immediate. We modern humans, most of us, have no idea how to obtain food from the wild. We depend on agricultural systems that require specific seeds, specific weather patterns, specific soil conditions. We depend on distribution systems that move food from farms to cities. Break any link in that chain, and people starve, even if food exists somewhere in the system. The same applies to almost every aspect of modern life. We depend on electricity grids that require constant maintenance and fuel supply. We depend on water systems that require infrastructure and energy to pump and purify. We depend on medical systems that require global pharmaceutical supply chains. We depend on communication systems that require satellites and fiber optics and data centers. Each of these systems requires hundreds or thousands of specialized skills to maintain, and each has potential points of failure that could cascade into broader system collapse. Homo erectus had none of these dependencies. They had fire, which required knowledge but not infrastructure. They had stone tools, which required skill but could be made from materials available almost anywhere. They had social cooperation, which required communication but not written records or formal institutions. If a Homo erectus group lost half its members to disease or accident, the survivors could rebuild. They had all the knowledge and skills necessary for survival distributed among the remaining individuals. If modern civilization lost half its population, the survivors would face catastrophic challenges. Most people don't know how to produce food, purify water, make tools, treat injuries, or perform the thousands of specialized tasks that keep technological society functioning. We've traded individual competence for collective capability, and that trade makes us vulnerable to disruptions that reduce population or break social connectivity. There's also a temporal dimension to this vulnerability. Homo erectus technology changed very slowly. The Acheulean hand axe tradition lasted over 1 million years with minimal modification. This meant knowledge was stable. What your grandparents taught you about making tools and finding food remained valid throughout your life and your children's lives. Cultural knowledge could be transmitted orally without loss of critical information. Each generation started with everything the previous generation knew. We modern humans live in a world of accelerating change. Technologies become obsolete within years or even months. The knowledge base required to maintain our civilization grows exponentially. We've had to invent systems to store and transmit information because individual human memory is insufficient. Writing, libraries, databases, the internet. But these systems are themselves complex and fragile. Digital information requires electricity and functioning computers. Written records require preservation against decay. If we lost our information storage systems, we'd lose most of accumulated human knowledge, and the pace of change means we're constantly adapting to new circumstances we created ourselves. We invented the automobile and had to completely reorganize cities and transportation networks. We invented computers and had to reorganize how we work and communicate. We invented social media and are still grappling with the social and psychological consequences. Each change requires adjustment, learning, adaptation, and the changes come faster than biological evolution can respond. We're living in environments our brains didn't evolve to handle, dealing with problems our ancestors never faced. Homo erectus faced a much more stable technological landscape. Their environment changed due to climate shifts, but their tools and techniques remained largely constant. They weren't constantly adjusting to novel circumstances they'd created. They weren't outrunning their own biological limitations. They existed in equilibrium with their technological toolkit. We're perpetually off balance, running to keep up with our own innovations. There's also the problem of unintended consequences. Every technology has effects beyond its intended purpose. Agriculture produced reliable food, but also enabled population growth that strained resources. Fossil fuels powered industrial civilization, but also drove climate change. Nuclear power provided abundant energy, but also created risks of catastrophic accidents and weapons proliferation. Artificial intelligence might solve countless problems, but also poses existential risks we're just beginning to understand. Our intelligence let us create all these technologies, but it hasn't given us the wisdom to fully anticipate their consequences. Homo erectus, with their simpler technologies, had fewer opportunities for self-inflicted harm. The worst they could do was overexploit local game populations or accidentally start a wildfire. Serious problems certainly, but not species-threatening. We can do much worse. We can alter the global climate. We can drive mass extinctions. We can potentially destroy ourselves in nuclear war, or through misaligned artificial intelligence, or through engineered pandemics. Our intelligence gave us godlike powers. But we're still running on ape brains evolved for much simpler problems. Some researchers talk about the cognitive mismatch problem. Our brains evolved to solve problems faced by small groups of hunter-gatherers on the African savanna. Immediate threats from predators and rival groups, finding food and water, forming alliances and raising children. These are problems our brains are very good at solving, but the problems we face now are different. Long-term consequences of current actions, risks that are probabilistic rather than certain, coordination challenges involving millions or billions of people, abstract threats like climate change that don't trigger our evolved danger responses. We struggle with these problems not because we're not intelligent enough, but because our intelligence evolved for different purposes. Homo erectus never had to worry about this mismatch. The problems they faced were the problems their brains evolved to solve. Immediate, concrete, social, environmental. They were perfectly matched to their circumstances. We're increasingly mismatched to ours. And there's the problem of collective action. Homo erectus groups were small enough that everyone knew everyone else. Cooperation emerged naturally from face-to-face interaction and reputation concerns. If you didn't cooperate, everyone knew and treated you accordingly. This kept groups functional without need for complex enforcement mechanisms. We modern humans try to cooperate at scales of millions or billions. Most of the people affected by our actions will never meet. Most of the consequences of our actions play out over timescales longer than individual lifetimes. This makes cooperation much harder. Climate change is the perfect example. We know collectively that continuing to burn fossil fuels will cause catastrophic warming. But individually, each person's contribution to the problem is negligible, and the consequences seem distant and abstract. So we struggle to coordinate effective responses even when we understand intellectually what needs to be done. Homo erectus never faced problems requiring this kind of large-scale long-term coordination. Their challenges were local and immediate. Ours are global and intergenerational. None of this means intelligence is inherently bad or that we should wish we were less smart. Intelligence has given us incredible capabilities, reduced suffering, extended lifespans, created art and science and everything worthwhile in human culture. But it's also created vulnerabilities that Homo erectus never had to deal with. And the question is whether we can use our intelligence to compensate for the vulnerabilities it creates. Can we design systems that are robust rather than fragile? Can we maintain the advantages of complex civilization while building in redundancy and resilience? Can we develop the wisdom to manage technologies that give us power beyond our evolved capacity to use responsibly? Can we coordinate globally to address existential threats? These are open questions. We don't know the answers yet. What we do know is that Homo erectus survived for 2 million years without having to solve any of these problems. They kept things simple, stayed adaptable, lived within their means, and they outlasted every other human species, including some that were smarter than them. The Neanderthals had brains as large as ours, possibly larger. They made sophisticated tools, created art, had complex social structures, and they went extinct. Homo erectus, with their smaller brains and simpler technology, outlasted them by over 1 million years. Maybe there's a lesson there. Maybe intelligence is valuable, but only up to a point. Maybe there's a sweet spot where you're smart enough to solve immediate problems, but not so smart that you create new problems faster than you can solve them. Maybe Homo erectus hit that sweet spot, and maybe we overshot it, or maybe we just need time to grow into our intelligence, to develop the wisdom and institutional structures to manage the power we've given ourselves, to learn from our mistakes before they kill us. We're only 300,000 years into this experiment. Homo erectus had 2 million years to work things out. Maybe we need to give ourselves more time before we judge whether intelligence is a survival advantage or a fatal flaw. But time is something we might not have much of, because the threats we've created with our intelligence are immediate and growing, and unlike Homo erectus, who had the luxury of learning slowly through trial and error over millions of years, we're facing existential challenges right now that require us to get things right on the first try. That's the vulnerability of intelligence. It gives you the power to destroy yourself before you develop the wisdom not to. Let's step back from the doom and gloom for a moment and really think about what made Homo erectus so successful. 2 million years, longer than any other human species, longer than most large mammal species manage. They weren't just lucky. They weren't just in the right place at the right time. They had strategies, adaptations, and ways of living that genuinely worked over geological timescales. And maybe, just maybe, we can learn something from them. First and most fundamental, they were generalists. This might not sound exciting, but in evolutionary terms, it's huge. Specialists are species that do one thing extremely well. Pandas eat bamboo, koalas eat eucalyptus, cheetahs run fast and hunt small gazelles. Specialization works beautifully when conditions are stable and your particular niche is secure. But when conditions change, when your food source disappears or your habitat transforms, specialists die. They can't adapt because their entire biology is optimized for one specific lifestyle. Homo erectus avoided this trap. They could eat almost anything, meat from hunting, absolutely, but also meat from scavenging when hunting failed. Plant foods, tubers, seeds, fruits, nuts, insects and grubs when other food was scarce, shellfish and fish when they lived near water. Essentially, if it was edible and available, they ate it. This dietary flexibility meant they could survive in radically different environments. Tropical forests where fruit was abundant, grasslands where game and tubers were primary foods, coastal areas where marine resources supplemented terrestrial ones. The evidence for this flexibility is written in their teeth. Tooth wear patterns from different Homo erectus populations show variations suggesting different diets in different regions. Some show heavy wear from gritty plant foods, others show patterns consistent with meat consumption. The isotope chemistry of their bones tells a similar story. They ate what was available. They didn't commit to being pure hunters or pure gatherers. They were opportunists in the best sense. This flexibility extended to their toolkit. Homo erectus made stone tools, primarily the Achillean hand axes and cleavers that dominated their technology for over 1 million years. But these weren't specialized implements. A hand axe could be used for butchering, for digging, for woodworking, for defense. It was a general-purpose tool that did many jobs adequately rather than one job perfectly. And this was actually an advantage. If you only had 1 or 2 tools, you wanted them to be versatile. You couldn't afford to carry a specialized implement for every possible task. They also adapted their tool use to local materials. In Africa, they made tools from fine-grained volcanic rocks like obsidian and basalt. In Java, they used local stone that sometimes required different techniques. In some areas where good stone was scarce, they probably used wood and bamboo tools that haven't survived in the archaeological record. They weren't wedded to one material or one technique. They used what worked with what they had available. Their social structure was probably similarly flexible. We can't know for certain, as social behavior doesn't fossilize, but based on modern hunter-gatherer societies and our understanding of primate behavior, Homo erectus likely lived in small egalitarian groups. Maybe 30 to 50 individuals mostly related to each other. Groups small enough that everyone knew everyone else, but large enough to provide security and labor sharing. When groups grew, too large, they probably split. When disaster reduced a group, survivors might join other groups or attract new members from elsewhere. This social flexibility would have been crucial for long-term survival. Rigid social hierarchies can become maladaptive when conditions change. But flexible groups that can reorganize based on circumstances are resilient. If your best hunter dies, someone else steps into that role. If 2 families can't get along, one splits off and forms a new group. Simple social structures are robust social structures. They also practiced what anthropologists call residential mobility. They moved. A lot. Not aimlessly, but strategically, following seasonal resources, avoiding depleted areas, exploring new territories. Modern hunter-gatherers often move camp dozens of times per year. Homo erectus probably did something similar. This mobility meant they never depleted resources to the point of local collapse. They took what they needed and moved on, allowing ecosystems to recover. It was sustainable not because they were trying to be conservationists, but because the math worked out. Small populations, high mobility, generalist diets equals sustainable resource use. This stands in stark contrast to agricultural societies, including our own, which are based on staying in one place and intensively exploiting local resources. Agriculture produces more food per unit area, allowing higher population densities. But it also requires stability. You have to stay in one place to tend crops, you have to have predictable weather patterns, and you have to accept that eventually you'll deplete the soil, or the forests, or the water sources. Many agricultural societies have collapsed precisely because they couldn't move when resources ran out. Homo erectus never faced that problem. Their population density was probably quite low. Estimates vary wildly because we don't have great data, but reasonable guesses suggest maybe a few million Homo erectus individuals spread across Africa and Asia at any given time, maybe fewer. For comparison, there are now 8 billion humans. Low population density meant reduced competition for resources, reduced disease transmission, and reduced environmental impact. They could live sustainably because they weren't numerous enough to overwhelm their environment. Low population density also meant each individual mattered enormously. In a group of 30, losing even one person is a significant loss of knowledge, skills, and reproductive potential. This probably encouraged risk-averse behavior and mutual care. Evidence of healed injuries and care for disabled individuals suggests they looked after each other. An injured person who recovered was still a valuable group member. This wasn't sentimentality, it was practical. In small populations, you can't afford to waste lives. Their technology changed slowly, and this was actually a strength, not a weakness. The Herculean hand axe tradition lasted over 1 million years, essentially unchanged. To us this looks like stagnation. No innovation, no progress, just doing the same thing generation after generation. But consider what this means. It means they'd found a solution that worked. A tool design that was effective, easy to make, easy to teach, and reliable. They didn't need to innovate because what they had was sufficient. Slow technological change also meant stable cultural knowledge. The skills your grandparents taught you remained relevant throughout your life and your children's lives and their children's lives. Knowledge could accumulate gradually without becoming obsolete. Each generation built on a stable foundation. Compare this to modern life where technology changes so fast that much of what you learned in school is outdated by the time you retire. Stability has value. They probably also had realistic expectations about life. This might sound strange, but bear with me. Modern humans, especially in developed societies, expect constant improvement. We expect each generation to live better than the previous one. We expect technology to solve our problems. We expect progress to be linear and ongoing. And when these expectations aren't met, we experience it as failure or crisis. Homo erectus almost certainly had no such expectations. Life was hard. Resources were uncertain. People died young. Bad things happened. This was normal. They probably didn't spend time mourning the fact that they weren't making constant progress. They focused on surviving and raising children who would survive. And this mindset, while not exactly optimistic, was realistic and sustainable. Their relationship with their environment was direct and unmediated. They experienced the consequences of their actions immediately. Overhunt in an area and game becomes scarce, so you move. Use all the easily accessible water and you have to find a new camp. This feedback was clear and fast. There was no way to externalize costs or defer problems to future generations. You lived with your impacts. This probably enforced a kind of rough sustainability, not out of environmental consciousness, but out of practical necessity. We modern humans have broken this feedback loop. We can dump pollution in rivers that flow somewhere else. We can emit greenhouse gases whose worst effects won't be felt for decades. We can deplete resources in one region and import from elsewhere. We can defer costs to future generations who will deal with the consequences of our actions. This breaks the connection between behavior and consequence, making it harder to live sustainably even when we want to. Homo erectus also had the advantage of time, lots of time. When you have 2 million years to work with, you can afford mistakes. A bad decision that reduces your population by 90%. Disastrous, but you have thousands of generations to recover. A climate shift that makes large regions uninhabitable. Terrible, but you have hundreds of thousands of years to adapt. The long time frame meant individual crises, while serious, weren't necessarily fatal to the species. There was always time to bounce back. We don't have that luxury. We're 300,000 years in and already facing existential threats of our own making. We need to figure out sustainability now, not over millions of years. We need to survive the consequences of our intelligence before we've had time to evolve the wisdom to use it properly. Homo erectus had the advantage of progressing slowly enough that evolution could keep up. We're changing too fast for biological evolution to help us. They were also probably quite good at reading their environment. Survival for a hunter-gatherer requires detailed knowledge of local ecology, which plants are edible and when, where water can be found during dry seasons, animal behavior and movement patterns, weather signs, ecological relationships between different species. This knowledge was accumulated over many generations and transmitted culturally. A Homo erectus individual probably knew their local environment better than most modern people know their neighborhoods. This deep environmental knowledge meant they could anticipate problems and adjust before crises became catastrophic. If certain indicator species disappeared, they knew food sources were declining and it was time to move. If weather patterns shifted, they adjusted their seasonal movements accordingly. They were intimately connected to the ecological systems they depended on. We've lost much of this connection through the mediation of technology and markets. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, they persisted. They didn't give up. Even when conditions got terrible, when climate shifted dramatically, when populations crashed, the survivors kept going. They adapted, they moved, they changed their strategies, they endured. And over 2 million years, this persistence paid off. They outlasted every other human species. They survived extinctions that killed countless other species. They made it work through dedication to the basic project of survival. This is the real lesson. Homo erectus succeeded not through brilliance or superior technology or revolutionary innovations. They succeeded through flexibility, persistence, and staying within their ecological means. They found strategies that worked and stuck with them. They adapted when necessary but didn't change for the sake of change. They lived simply, moved frequently, ate diversely, and cooperated in small groups. And it worked for 2 million years. Can we learn from this? Can a species with 8 billion members, complex technologies, and global civilizations adopt any of these strategies? Probably not directly. We can't go back to being mobile hunter-gatherers. We've committed to a different path. But maybe we can learn some principles. Flexibility over specialization, sustainability over short-term gains, direct feedback over externalized costs, realistic expectations over constant progress, persistence in the face of challenges. Homo erectus showed it's possible to survive over geological timescales, not through dominating the environment or transcending ecological limits, through working within them, through being adaptable, resilient, and humble enough to live as part of the ecosystem, rather than trying to stand outside it. They did it for 2 million years. We're trying to figure out if we can do it for even 1 million. And they've left us a template, written in fossils and stone tools and the very fact of their incredible endurance. Whether we're wise enough to learn from it remains to be seen. Now comes the uncomfortable part, looking at ourselves through the lens of evolutionary success and asking honestly whether we're on a sustainable path. Spoiler alert, we're not. In almost every way that Homo erectus got things right, we're doing the opposite. And while that's made us incredibly powerful in the short term, it's creating vulnerabilities that could end us long before we match their 2 million year run. Let's start with the most obvious problem: population. Homo erectus probably never numbered more than a few million individuals spread across 3 continents. We're at 8 billion and counting. 8 billion humans requiring food, water, shelter, energy. 8 billion humans producing waste, consuming resources, competing for space. The sheer scale of human population is unprecedented in the history of large mammals, and it's fundamentally unsustainable. Every additional human requires resources, food from agriculture that requires land, water, and energy, shelter that requires materials and space. The extraction of these resources degrades ecosystems. Agricultural land replaces forests and grasslands. Water extraction depletes aquifers and rivers. Energy production, whether from fossil fuels or renewables, requires mining, manufacturing, and infrastructure. The ecological footprint of 8 billion humans is crushing the planet's ecosystems, and we keep growing. Population projections suggest we might reach 10 or 11 billion before stabilizing. Maybe, if we're lucky. Each additional billion makes sustainability harder. More food needed, more water, more energy, more land, more waste to deal with. At some point, the math simply doesn't work. The planet has finite resources and finite capacity to absorb our waste. We're approaching or have already exceeded those limits in many areas. Homo erectus avoided this trap through low population density and high mobility. They never grew numerous enough to overwhelm their environment. We've deliberately pursued the opposite strategy. Agriculture enabled population growth by producing food surpluses. Cities concentrated populations in ways that required massive resource inputs. And we celebrated this as progress. More people, bigger cities, greater production. We built an entire economic system predicated on constant growth. And now we're discovering that infinite growth on a finite planet is impossible. Then there's specialization. We've mentioned this before, but it bears repeating because it's so central to our vulnerability. Modern humans are extreme specialists. Most people in developed societies can't produce their own food, can't build their own shelter, can't make their own tools or clothing. We depend on vast systems of specialized labor. Farmers grow food, manufacturers make goods, engineers maintain infrastructure. Each person does one narrow task and depends on thousands of others to do their tasks. This creates efficiency. Specialization lets us produce more with less effort, but it also creates brittleness. If any crucial part of the system fails, the whole thing can collapse. Farmers need fuel for their equipment, which requires oil refineries, which require electricity, which requires power plants, which require maintenance, which requires spare parts, which require manufacturing, which requires raw materials, which require mining, which requires equipment, which requires... You see the problem. Everything depends on everything else. Break enough links, and the entire chain fails. Homo erectus avoided this by being competent generalists. Every adult could find food, make tools, build shelter, navigate, teach children. Lose half your group and the survivors still had all the skills needed for survival. Lose half of modern civilization and the survivors would struggle because most specialized knowledge would be lost. We've traded individual competence for collective capability, and that trade makes us vulnerable to disruptions that break collective structures. We've also specialized ecologically. We depend on a narrow range of domesticated species: wheat, rice, corn, soybeans, potatoes. A dozen plant species provide most of human food. A handful of animal species provide most of our meat. These are species we've modified through selective breeding to produce high yields in agricultural conditions. But they're also species that require specific conditions, specific inputs of water and fertilizer, protection from pests and diseases. If climate change disrupts the conditions these species need, we're in serious trouble because we've lost the knowledge to survive on wild foods. Homo erectus ate hundreds of different species. They knew which plants were edible, which had medicinal properties, which were toxic. They hunted dozens of different game animals. They adjusted their diet based on seasonal availability and local ecology. We've lost most of that knowledge in exchange for high-efficiency production of a few crops, and we're discovering that efficiency and resilience are often opposites. Our relationship with the environment has become abstract and disconnected. Most people in modern societies never see where their food comes from, where their water comes from, where their waste goes. Food appears in supermarkets. Water comes from taps. Waste disappears when we flush or throw it away. We've severed the direct feedback between our actions and their environmental consequences. This makes it psychologically easy to overexploit and pollute, because we don't directly experience the results. Homo erectus had immediate feedback. Overhunt an area and you go hungry. Foul your water source and you get sick. The consequences of environmental mismanagement were obvious and immediate. We can pollute rivers we never see, emit gases whose effects we won't experience for decades, deplete resources on the other side of the planet. We've externalized the costs of our lifestyle to other places and other times, and this broken feedback loop makes sustainable behavior much harder. Climate change is the ultimate example of broken feedback. We emit greenhouse gases that accumulate in the atmosphere. The warming effects play out over decades. The worst consequences will hit future generations. The people making decisions about emissions right now won't experience most of the impacts. This temporal disconnect makes collective action incredibly difficult. We know intellectually that continuing current emissions will cause catastrophe. but the catastrophe feels distant and abstract. So we keep emitting. Homo erectus faced climate change too, dramatic climate change, but they couldn't cause it, they could only respond to it. And their responses were direct and immediate. Climate shifts, you move to more favourable areas or adjust your lifestyle. Consequences happen in human time spans, sometimes within a single generation. The feedback is clear. We've created a situation where our actions have consequences decades or centuries in the future. Evolution never prepared us to handle that kind of delayed feedback. We're also destroying the ecological systems we depend on at an alarming rate. Habitat destruction for agriculture and development, overfishing that collapses marine ecosystems, deforestation that eliminates carbon sinks and biodiversity, pollution that poisons ecosystems. We're driving what biologists call the sixth mass extinction. Species are disappearing at rates hundreds of times higher than background extinction rates. And we're doing this while depending on functional ecosystems for our own survival. Ecosystem services, things like pollination of crops, water purification, climate regulation, pest control, are provided by complex ecological communities. Disrupt those communities and the services fail. We're discovering that you can't just eliminate species without consequences. Everything's connected. Take out enough species and entire ecosystems can collapse, and we depend on those ecosystems more than we realize. Agriculture requires pollinators. Water requires natural filtration. Climate regulation requires forests and oceans functioning properly. Destroy ecosystems and we undermine the foundations of our own survival. Homo erectus had low enough populations and simple enough technology that their environmental impact was minimal and local. They couldn't cause mass extinctions or ecosystem collapse on continental scales. We can, and we are. We've become a geological force, powerful enough to alter the planet's climate and cause mass extinctions. But we're still operating with the psychology and decision-making capabilities of small group primates. We have godlike power without the wisdom to use it responsibly. Then there's the technology trap. We've become so dependent on technology that we can't survive without it. This seems like an advantage until you realize how vulnerable it makes us. Modern humans in developed societies would die within days or weeks if our technological systems failed. No electricity means no water pumping, no food refrigeration, no communication, no medical equipment. No fuel means no transportation, no agriculture, no manufacturing. No global trade means no access to materials and products we depend on, but don't produce locally. We've built a civilization that requires constant inputs of energy and materials to function. Stop those inputs, and everything collapses rapidly. Homo erectus needed fire and stone tools. Lose fire and they'd struggle but survive. Lose stone tools and they could make new ones from materials available almost anywhere. Their technology was simple enough that they carried the knowledge to recreate it in their heads. Our technology is so complex that no individual understands more than a tiny fraction of it. We're collectively brilliant but individually helpless. The speed of change we've created is also problematic. Homo erectus technology barely changed for 1 million years. They had time to learn, to adapt, to transmit stable knowledge across generations. We're changing technology faster than we can understand the consequences. Social media was invented less than 20 years ago and has already transformed politics, psychology, and social relations in ways we're still trying to understand. Artificial intelligence is developing so rapidly that even experts can't predict what it'll be capable of in 10 years. We're creating futures we can't anticipate, let alone control. This rapid change means we're constantly adapting to novel circumstances. Circumstances our evolutionary psychology didn't prepare us for. We evolved to live in small groups with face-to-face interaction. Now we navigate complex hierarchies and interact with thousands of people through electronic media. We evolved to respond to immediate physical threats. Now we face abstract statistical risks like climate change and nuclear war. We evolved to learn from direct experience. Now we depend on understanding complex systems through abstract reasoning. We're mismatched to the world we've created, and we're running out of time to figure it out. Homo erectus had 2 million years to gradually refine their lifestyle. We need to solve existential problems in decades. Climate change requires global action now, not in a century. Ecosystem collapse is happening now. The sixth, extinction is happening now. Nuclear weapons could end civilization tomorrow. Artificial intelligence might pose existential risks within our lifetimes. We're facing threats that require long-term thinking, global cooperation, and careful management of powerful technologies. And we're not very good at any of those things. Our political and economic systems make things worse. We've divided the world into competing nations with different interests and goals. Cooperation on global problems is difficult when nations prioritize short-term national interests over long-term species survival. Our economic systems prioritize growth and profit over sustainability. Corporations are legally required to maximize shareholder value, not to consider long-term ecological impacts. The incentives are all wrong for addressing existential threats. Homo erectus never had to solve coordination problems involving billions of people across the entire planet. Their largest coordination problem was keeping a group of 30 people cooperating. That's a scale human psychology can handle. We're trying to coordinate 8 billion people with conflicting interests, different values, and incompatible economic systems. It's arguably the most difficult challenge any species has ever faced, and we're not doing well at it. Perhaps most troubling, we've lost the humility that might have kept us cautious. We believe in our ability to solve any problem through intelligence and technology. We've conquered diseases, walked on the moon, split the atom, decoded the human genome. Every major challenge we've faced, we've eventually overcome through clever thinking and hard work. So we assume we can solve the problems we're creating now. Climate change? We'll invent carbon capture. Ecosystem collapse? We'll engineer replacement systems. Resource depletion? We'll find substitutes. This confidence might be justified, but it might also be hubris. Homo erectus never had the option of believing they could transcend ecological limits. They lived within those limits because they had no choice, and that enforced humility kept them alive for 2 million years. We believe we can exceed limits, reshape nature, engineer our way out of problems we've created, and maybe we can. But maybe we're overestimating our abilities and underestimating the complexity of the systems we're disrupting. The hard truth is that by almost every measure that matters for long-term species survival, we're doing things wrong. We're too numerous, too specialized, too technologically dependent, too disconnected from environmental feedback, too confident in our abilities. We're running a species-level experiment that's never been tried before. Extreme intelligence and technology combined with global population in the billions and civilization-level complexity. Can it work over millions of years? We don't know. But the early results aren't encouraging. Homo erectus showed us a different path. Simple technology, low populations, flexible generalist lifestyle, direct environmental feedback, living within limits. They proved that path can work for 2 million years. We're trying something radically different, and we won't know if it works until it's too late to change course if it doesn't. So here we are at the end of this journey through deep time, you and me, thinking about 2 million years versus 300,000. Thinking about what it means to survive, really survive, on timescales so vast they dwarf all of human history. If you're still awake, you're probably wrestling with some uncomfortable questions. And if you're drifting off, maybe these thoughts will follow you into sleep, into dreams about species that rose and fell while continents shifted and ice ages came and went. The lesson from Homo erectus isn't complicated, it's actually brutally simple. Survival over deep time requires living within your means, not pushing systems to their breaking point, not becoming so specialized that you can't adapt, not growing so numerous that you exhaust your environment, not building complexity so fragile that it shatters under stress. They understood this, probably not consciously, but through 2 million years of trial and error, their lineage learned what worked. And what worked was simplicity, flexibility, and humility. We modern humans are running the opposite experiment. Maximum complexity, extreme specialization, enormous populations, technological dependence. We're betting that intelligence can transcend the rules that governed every other species, that we're smart enough to engineer solutions faster than we create problems, that we can maintain an elaborate interconnected civilization indefinitely, despite it requiring stability that Earth's history suggests is temporary. Maybe we're right. Maybe intelligence really is a trump card that lets us escape the constraints that limited Homo erectus. Maybe we can manage complexity, coordinate globally, solve existential threats, and maintain our civilization for millions of years. It's possible. We're certainly capable of remarkable things when we put our minds to it. The question isn't whether we can solve individual problems. The question is whether we can solve them all, simultaneously, indefinitely, without failing even once in ways that end us. Because that's what Homo erectus did. They didn't fail catastrophically for 2 million years. They had bad times, absolutely. Populations crashed. Regional extinctions happened. Climate disasters killed countless individuals. But as a species, they persisted. They never failed so completely that they couldn't recover. And they did this without intelligence remotely comparable to ours, without technology remotely as sophisticated, without the ability to deliberately plan for deep future. They did it through resilience. We've traded resilience for capability. We can do things Homo erectus couldn't imagine. We can fly through the air. We can communicate instantly across continents. We can cure diseases, predict weather, understand the fundamental nature of matter and energy. We've built a civilization of incredible sophistication and power. But is it durable? Can it survive a major disruption? Can it persist for thousands of centuries? The answer depends on whether we can maintain the conditions our civilization requires. Stable climate, functioning ecosystems, available resources, global cooperation, technological continuity. These conditions are not guaranteed. Climate is changing in ways we've never experienced. Ecosystems are collapsing under the weight of human activity. Resources are depleting. International cooperation is fragile. Technology requires constant maintenance and innovation to function. Homo erectus didn't depend on any of these things remaining stable. They adjusted to whatever conditions they encountered. Climate changed, they moved or adapted their behavior. Ecosystems shifted, they ate different foods. Resources in one area depleted, they moved to another area. They didn't need cooperation beyond their immediate group. Their technology was simple enough to recreate anywhere. They were anti-fragile in ways we're not. But let's be clear, this isn't an argument for abandoning civilization and returning to hunter-gatherer lifestyles. That's neither possible nor desirable for 8 billion people. The world we created has many genuine benefits. Longer lifespans, reduced suffering, incredible cultural and scientific achievements. Most of us wouldn't trade modern medicine, education, and opportunity for the harsh uncertainties of Pleistocene life, even if it came with 2 million-year species longevity. The question is whether we can retain the benefits of civilization while building in the resilience that Homo erectus had naturally. Can we design systems that are robust as well as efficient? Can we maintain technological capability while ensuring we're not helplessly dependent on it? Can we coordinate globally while preserving local self-sufficiency? Can we use our intelligence not just to create powerful technologies but to manage them wisely? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're the actual challenges we face. And to be honest, we're not doing great so far. We're still prioritizing short-term growth over long-term sustainability. We're still building systems that are efficient but fragile. We're still treating symptoms while ignoring root causes. We're still hoping that somehow, despite all the warning signs, things will work out because they always have before. But this is where deep time perspective matters. Things haven't always worked out. Most species go extinct. Most civilizations collapse. The historical record is full of societies that thought they'd last forever and didn't make it past a few centuries. The difference is that previous collapses were regional. Now we're global. If our civilization fails, there's no untouched area to rebuild from. If we exhaust key resources or disrupt crucial ecosystems, there are no reserves elsewhere. We're all in this together, for better or worse. Homo erectus teaches us that long-term survival is possible, that a human species can persist for millions of years through dramatic environmental changes. But they also teach us that this kind of survival requires certain characteristics: flexibility to adapt to changing conditions, restraint in exploiting resources, humility about our place in nature. These are not values that come naturally to modern civilization. We're taught to maximize, optimize, grow, dominate. These values created our success in the short term. They might be creating our failure in the long term. The cosmic perspective makes this even starker. Earth has been habitable for billions of years and will remain so for perhaps 1 billion more before the sun's increasing luminosity makes it too hot for complex life. That's an enormous span of time. Homo erectus existed for 1/500th of that potential future. We've existed for 1/3000th. If we're going to make a real mark, if we're going to matter in the deep history of life on Earth, we need to match or exceed Homo erectus's achievement. We need to survive not for thousands of years, but for millions. And here's the humbling part. If we go extinct in the next few thousand years, which is entirely possible given the threats we're creating, we'll be a brief anomaly in Earth's history, a species that got smart fast, built impressive things, and burned out quickly. Future paleontologists, if any exist, might find our fossils and artifacts and wonder what happened. Why did these intelligent primates with their sophisticated technology disappear so quickly? The answer might be that we were too smart for our own good, that we gained the power to reshape the planet before developing the wisdom to do it sustainably. Homo erectus will be remembered, in the geological record at least, as a success. 2 million years of fossils spread across 3 continents, evidence of adaptation to diverse environments, proof that the human lineage could persist over deep time. What will we be remembered as? The smart ones who couldn't make it work? Or will we surprise ourselves and everyone else by actually figuring out how to manage our intelligence, our population, our technology in ways that let us survive for geological timescales? The answer isn't written yet. We're 300,000 years into the experiment. Homo erectus made it to 2 million. We have 1,700,000 years to go to match them, and we have to navigate climate change, ecosystem collapse, nuclear weapons, potential artificial intelligence risks, and whatever other challenges we create for ourselves along the way. The odds don't look great. But maybe that's too pessimistic, because we have something Homo erectus didn't have. We can learn from the past. We can look at 2 million years of their fossils and figure out what worked. We can study our own history and see patterns of what leads to collapse versus what leads to persistence. We can use our intelligence deliberately to design for resilience rather than just efficiency. We can choose, if we're wise enough, to prioritize long-term survival over short-term gain. The lesson from deep time is ultimately about perspective. When you measure success in millions of years, a lot of what we worry about daily becomes trivial. Stock market fluctuations, political scandals, social media controversies. These things matter in the moment, but they're noise on the timescale that matters. What matters is whether we're building something that can last, whether we're living in ways that could continue for 10,000 generations, whether we're being good ancestors to people who won't exist for thousands of years. Homo erectus didn't consciously think about deep time. They couldn't conceive of millions of years, but they lived in ways that happened to work over those timescales, simple, flexible, within their means. We can consciously think about deep time. We can understand what geological timescales mean. The question is whether we can translate that understanding into action, whether we can make decisions today based on consequences that will play out over thousands or millions of years. This is hard, really hard. Evolution didn't prepare us for this kind of thinking. Our brains evolved to worry about immediate threats and opportunities, not abstract long-term consequences. But if we're going to survive as long as Homo erectus, we need to develop this capability. We need to become a species that thinks in deep time, that plans for a future beyond our individual lives or even our immediate descendants. That makes choices based on what will matter in 10,000 years, not just what profits in the next quarter. Maybe we can do it. Maybe our intelligence, properly applied, really can let us escape the limitations that bound Homo erectus. Maybe we can maintain complex civilization indefinitely, solve all the problems we create, coordinate globally, manage technology wisely. Maybe we're at the beginning of a run that will make 2 million years look brief. Maybe 1 million years from now, our descendants will look back and see our time as the awkward adolescence of the human species, when we were smart enough to be dangerous but not yet wise enough to be safe. Or maybe we're the species that proved intelligence without wisdom is a fatal combination. That got too clever too fast and destroyed ourselves before learning restraint. That showed future evolution, if there is any, that big brains are an evolutionary dead end because they let you build things you can't sustain. Maybe we're the cautionary tale. We don't know yet which story we are, the smart ones who figured it out or the smart ones who didn't, the species that matched or exceeded Homo erectus, or the species that burned bright and brief, the beginning of something lasting or just. Another failed experiment in Earth's long history of life trying different strategies. But we're here now, we're the ones living through this crucial period, and that means the answer depends on us, on choices we make collectively over the next centuries and millennia, on whether we can develop the wisdom to match our intelligence, on whether we can learn from Homo erectus what it takes to survive in deep time. So as you drift off to sleep thinking about 2 million years versus 300,000 years, thinking about species that rise and fall and the long sweep of geological time, remember this. Homo erectus set the bar. They showed it's possible for a human species to survive over timeframes that dwarf our recorded history. They did it without our advantages, but also without our disadvantages. They kept things simple and it worked for longer than any other human species managed. We're trying something different. Something more complex, more ambitious, potentially more capable, but also more fragile. Whether it works remains to be seen. We're still early in the experiment. We have a long way to go to prove we can match their achievement. But the fact that they did it shows it's possible. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough reason to hope we can too. The lesson from deep time isn't that we're doomed. It's that survival is possible but not guaranteed. That it requires living within limits, maintaining flexibility, and having the humility to recognize we're not above the rules that govern all life. Homo erectus knew this, in their way. Now, we need to learn it in ours. 2 million years is the goal, 300,000 down, 1,700,000 to go. The clock is ticking. But unlike Homo erectus, we know we're being timed. And sometimes, awareness is the first step toward survival. Sleep well, dream of deep time. And remember that every day we survive, every generation we successfully raise, every adaptation we make to changing circumstances, we're continuing the story that Homo erectus started 2 million years ago. The story of humans trying to survive on a changing planet. They lasted an incredibly long time. Now it's our turn to try.